Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
Helen waited patiently for the call to be answered. It was ringing. No one picked up the phone. She was about to drop the call. Suddenly, Maria's phone was picked up on the other end of the line. He brought her here. Helen was crying. Who was the worried voice of her friend? Kate, that lover we saw today. I can't take it anymore. The woman said it through tears and sobs. After every word she uttered, "Wait, I'll be right there." The friend answered and hung up the phone. Maria and Helen had been friends since childhood. Only Maria's fate in the city was much easier than her friend's. She worked as a paramedic. She had dreamed of such a job since she was a child. She wanted to help people more than anything else. Once, when she was still young, she helped to correct a dislocation of a child who had fallen down the stairs. Her parents immediately realized that their daughter is very talented and sent her to study in the city. As soon as she finished school, her friend Helen went with her. It turns out that Uncle Maria had a tiny one-room apartment. The friends settled there. Helen decided to learn to neck. This did not require special education. The main thing in this occupation is that the hands knew how to work. And Helen had such a skill. She often had to help at the moment with clothes. However, she did not like working in the city very much. Here everything had to be done 3 times faster and bend your back from early morning until late evening. The girl was very tired. After weekdays, she came very late, almost no rest. Such a life lasted an agonizingly long time. However, everything was not always so bad. Finally, she met a handsome young man, who soon became her husband. All the girlfriends at the factory were jealous of her. She could get a guy like that. She was already 28 years old at the time. Almost all her friends were married long ago. And Maria then also had time to divorce from her bad husband Alkash, and was again in search. And only Helen felt strongly from becoming in this matter. Just a little longer, and the old maids would start calling. However, this guy had helped her feel like a 17-year-old girl again. It was the most banal, but for her a marvelous dating story. One morning, Helen was rushing to the factory as usual, and on the way some clumsy guy came whirling at her. He didn't seem to see where he was going and was seriously preoccupied with something. The inattentive young man not only knocked the girl off her feet, but also dropped all the documents from his folder. Everything went flying into the air. Helen helped him pick up what was left. The guy was very embarrassed. He apologized to the stranger for a long time and finally walked her to the factory. And then every evening began to meet her from there and soon asked for her hand in marriage. For the first year of their life together, everything was just fine. They were a happy family. Benjamin worked as an engineer. He didn't really like to talk about his work, but Helen knew that he designed airplanes. He was 29 years old at the time. The salary was very good, and the job itself was considered terribly prestigious. Helen's friends admired her husband, and she was proud of him and her new life. They settled into a wonderful apartment in Washington, close to the center, clean. All the amenities. Live and be happy. While the young husband was on the waiting list for housing, they decided to rent and did not miss out. The landlady was very friendly. There were never any difficulties with her. The lonely woman had a heart for her tenants and often brought the young people something delicious homemade. Helen lived like in a fairy tale. Now she didn't have to work in a factory. Her husband's salary provided them with an amazing life without the need to count pennies. Every day, Benjamin delighted Helen with kisses and affectionate hugs, often bringing her flowers. Every weekend they went for walks. What she remembered most were the unforgettable evenings at the amusement park. After a nice walk along the Washington River, Benjamin took her to ride the carousel. At first, Helen, who had never been on one before, was apprehensive. However, Benjamin persuaded her to ride once, and she did. The country girl forever remembered those butterflies in her stomach and a slight excitement in her chest. Afterwards, they ate ice cream at a cafe and walked around the night lit by the bright lights of Washington, D.C. until late in the evening. Benjamin always surprised his young wife. After all, he was born in Washington and had always lived here. And for her, many things were new. And he, in turn, considered it his duty to show Helen all the sights and corners of his native city, all the historical places, parks, where you could find different exciting activities. Once he even made her ride a bicycle with him. But Helen had been inept. Parents have always considered this transport very trauma dangerous, so they forbade even to approach the Iron Horse. And these bicycles in the village were a couple of old bikes in the boys, and all the new bikes were a commodity too expensive and few could afford it. After a few weeks of persuasion from her husband, Helen agreed to try. She loved to do something new, even if it was a bit intimidating at first. "Look, you pedal, hold the steering wheel and drive," the guy explained. It was early morning, Sunday summer. This day, the young couple decided to spend in the park. The weather was perfect, so Benjamin once again offered his wife to try cycling. A successful young man like Benjamin could afford to buy a bicycle. Empty, a waste in those old days. The salesman assured her that the quality of the transportation determined the price, which was not insignificant. Helen carefully followed her husband's movements. He was showing her how the bicycle was organized. For clarity, Benjamin demonstrated it in action. On 2 wheels, he sped away in 2 seconds, but immediately returned, so as not to keep his lady waiting for long. Ta followed his every action very closely. How did he slow down and get off? And now it was her turn. The guy handed the girl the part and helped her to sit down. "There aren't many people around right now, and that's good for us. You don't want to crush a man, do you?" Benjamin laughed. The girl was not happy about the joke. She was even a little hesitant to drive the vehicle. Just kidding," Benjamin added. Realizing that his joke was completely out of place, he noticed his wife's trembling hands. When she trembled like that, she was usually terribly afraid, and he added fuel to the fire. Helen put one foot on the pedal and did just as her husband had shown her, and she drove. However, this ride did not last long, and in just a few seconds, the bike along with the unit were lying on the grass. Benjamin immediately ran up to the poor thing with a worried expression on his face. It was only the first time. He cheered his wife up, "And you've lasted quite a long time." He picked her up and continued, "Remember when you taught me how to make pancakes? Although those pancakes were already 10 of them." And he laughed merrily. These words really had a positive effect on Helen. Benjamin was able to both comfort her and make her laugh. She forgot about her failure and got back on the bike. She fell 3 more times, but with each attempt she rode more and more. Finally, she felt quite confident. This time it was definitely going to work out. She had already shown up and knew how to keep her balance. Helen took a deep breath and drove. There were more people and the road was getting weirder, but that didn't stop her from practicing. "Are you doing well, Helen?" Encouraged, shouted Benjamin, running after the girl. She was smiling at her success. She had already covered more than 600 meters and had not fallen once. Her husband was no longer running after her as she had gained a lot of speed. She was very happy about her little victory, but unfortunately, this joy did not last long. Did something happen? Helen heard some sort of pop, and the bike immediately jumped up as if to shriek. The horse. She felt a jolt, and then instantly she was swung sideways. She hit the brake, and before she could even think straight, she suddenly realized there was a little boy ahead of her. One more second, and she would run over him. Helen swerved the steering wheel to the left and fell straight into the water. Luckily, she could swim. As soon as she surfaced from the depths of the pond, she saw the startled looks of the people on the boat. Those offered her their help and pulled her out of the water. She was still in shock, for it had all happened too quickly. However, her summer dress was completely wet from the shore, with Benjamin looking at her, shocked. He shouted something, but Helen heard nothing. She only realized that the boat was moving closer to the shore. In a few minutes, they were already at the station. Fortunately, it was not far away. After all, everything that had happened right by the shore. 2 park rangers and her worried husband immediately ran up to her. He threw his jacket over her and took her aside. To calm her down, Helen was hysterical mostly from being so embarrassed. "Benjamin," she cried into her husband's shoulder. He consoled her in every possible way and even called a cab to get her home as soon as possible. It's not a bad thing to catch a cold like that. Later it turned out that Helen had hit a nail, which led to the first tire. Benjamin argued with the park's spectators for a long time, because even someone's child could step on this rusty object and get injured. Though in his heart he knew it wasn't their fault. They can't keep track of every rusty nail, and he ended up getting nothing but an apology. However, this incident was memorable for Helen for a long time. For now, she could really ride her bike at least for the next few times after this incident. She sat on it reluctantly. For the first few years, the spouses lived in each other's hearts without tea. These were the best years, the happiest and the best. The most beautiful day was when Helen found out about the pregnancy. It had been 3 years since they had been married. Helen waited a long time for her husband from work to tell him this wonderful news. He was very late that day, which was not like him at all. And she had made him such a delicious dinner. She couldn't wait to share this overwhelming news. The first person she wanted to tell it to. Of course, it was Benjamin, the father-to-be, but he was still away. Finally, Helen realized it would be too late for dinner. Something must have happened at Benjamin's work, but she didn't put the food away. Finally, the lock turned on the door. Helen ran into the hallway in high spirits, but her husband came home terribly depressed. He threw his bat on the hall table and went into the bedroom without even taking off his shoes, without even looking at his wife. Of course, Helen was very surprised at such horrible behavior. She stood at the door for a while, as if analyzing what had happened. Then she heard the sound of broken glass and immediately rushed into the room. What she saw terrified her. Benjamin stood in the middle of the room. There were shards of broken glass all around him, and there was water everywhere on the floor. Helen suddenly realized what had happened, and anger flashed in her eyes. Her husband had broken her favorite vase, which contained only recently given chrysanthemums. "What are you doing?" Helen shouted, not expecting herself to be so loud. Benjamin only gave her a menacing look. He was obviously very upset about something, so much so that he had allowed himself to break his wife's favorite thing. He looked once more at his own handiwork, and then sat down on the bed and covered his face with his hands and sighed heavily. And then Helen saw him calm again. However, still a grim expression on her face, she sat down beside her, hugged her husband by the shoulders, and very quietly asked, "Dear, what has happened?" He looked at her with that pitiful look, like a puppy looking at its dying mother or a child bereft of its dreams. Helen had never seen him in such a state. They had been married for a long time, but Benjamin had never allowed himself to behave like this in front of his wife, and then buried his face in her hair. They sat like that for a few minutes. "It smells so good on you." Benjamin finally gave out and suddenly burst into tears. Helen realized it was time to take control of the situation. She gently pulled her husband away from her and looked him in the eyes with that pure and devoted look that was surely meant to let him know that she was on his side. And no matter what happened, no matter what he said, none of it would have any effect on her attitude toward him. Benjamin realized that Helen was waiting for a response of some sort of explanation. He looked at her again and lowered his head. The man clearly didn't want to look Helen in the eye, as if he was ashamed of something. "I was fired, Helen," he finally announced in a shaky voice and looked at his wife again. She had a smile on her face. It felt as if the world had just turned upside down. It still couldn't get to her. The awful truth of those words was dismissed. How could it be? Pitifully and quietly she asked, and in her eyes read panic. "I had miscalculated." Because of that, the transport was designed incorrectly. It was a very grave mistake, and I made that mistake repeatedly. In the end, the chief engineer wrote a report, and I was simply thrown out. Benjamin shouted in his heart and jumped out of bed. "But you didn't tell me you were in such trouble before because you didn't want you to think I was so worthless. And now I've left us destitute." Benjamin was at it again, but Helen wouldn't let him. "Look at me," she asked, stepping closer. "You and I can handle this. We can do it, and you'll find another job. You'll find another job. You've been working in manufacturing for so many years. You'll get a job somewhere." Benjamin didn't answer anything. He had always been a strong man and did not allow himself to show weakness in front of his wife. She should know that she was behind a rocky back, But he had let her down, and so now he was sitting there trying to hold back tears. Dinner had already gone cold. But after the news brought by Benjamin, it was no longer wanted. The couple went to bed without even touching their food. And Helen decided to hold off with her own news. Things would have to settle down first. Now Benjamin had to worry only about work, not about how they would support the child. However, those thoughts were now plaguing Helen. She couldn't sleep at night. She drank various herbal teas that the doctor had advised her, but nothing helped. Her husband every day became more and more irritable, not thin, shouting over the span and tea that the bed was not so made, or the chicken turned out too dry. Days went by. Benjamin had not even begun to look for work. He sat at home and read the newspapers. There was no development. "What are you reading?" Helen asked him at breakfast one day. She was on her second cup of strong tea. "Never mind, you better not get into women's politics. It's not supposed to be interesting. You better read a cookbook, because our lunches are tasteless," her husband replied, not even taking his eyes off the newspaper. Of course, Helen was hurt by this statement, but she tried to keep perfectly calm. In her position, it was impossible to be nervous. It had been a week since Benjamin had been fired. The woman was still silent. She had made a vow to herself that until Benjamin found a job, he would not find out about the baby. He's not going to look for her for 9 months. And the second and third week passed, but nothing had changed in the couple's life. Only now Benjamin was often out late. In the morning, he said he was going out to look for work, but every time he returned late at night, Helen could smell his breath. On one such day, Benjamin was gone for a long time again. It was already 10:00 p.m. at home, and Helen was beginning to worry. He had said he had gone to the store to get groceries, but he had left at 6:00 p.m., and it had been 3+ hours, and he was still gone. Dinner had long since gone cold, and Helen figured her husband wouldn't be eating when he got back. Since the time was quite late, Maria spoke into the phone receiver. "How are you?" "Haven't talked to you in a while. I thought I'd give you a call." "Oh, Helen, are you?" A friend answered cheerfully. "I'm fine. I just came home from my shift tired." "It's a nightmare. How are you?" "Not sad." "No," Helen said thoughtfully. However, still decided to tell her old friends all about their troubles and about her interesting situation. "So Benjamin knows nothing?" Maria asked in surprise. "No, why should he?" "Yesterday he left home in the morning and came at 22:00, and now it's already 12:00, and he hasn't seen or heard a thing. I don't know what happened, but don't worry about it. He'll come back. He'll be a strong man. You'll be able to stand up for yourself. The main thing is not to delay the news, or it will be a very unexpected surprise." Helen mumbled something inaudible in response and hung up the phone. Talking to her friend didn't ease her suffering at all. On the contrary, it intensified them even more. She had to tell her legal husband about the baby, and she was going to do it today. As soon as he crossed the threshold of this apartment, she planned to approach this very gently. News like this had to be broken very gently, especially when the news was over 3 weeks old. Finally, there was a long-awaited click at the keyhole. But what she saw completely shocked her. It was her own husband. But in what shape? His shirt was torn in several places. His pants were in something of an overprint. One pant leg was almost torn off. Cigarette fumes wafted a mile away. And in his hand, he was holding a cob and a bottle of beer. In a word, an alcoholic, an alcoholic. It was the first time she'd ever seen him in such a terrible state. He really looked like a homeless bum. Helen, unable to stand it. The sight snapped her into a scream for the first time in 3 weeks. She hadn't allowed herself to do such a thing before. Firstly, because she was not allowed to be nervous, and secondly, she wanted to be a pillar and support for her husband, not cranky. "Tired of you and your wife. What is this? Where have you been, hysterical Helen?" She couldn't believe this was happening to her and her solid husband. "Where are your things? Where's the bag of money?" Helen began to examine her husband, searching him like the police in an interrogation. Where is the money, Benjamin?" Shocked, she said, not finding his wallet with him. She knew that he always carried the rest of his savings with him. It was a habit. Benjamin had been looking at her the whole time with the kind of cocky grin that people who know something and are just mocking have. "Doesn't it look like they're being mocked?" Benjamin asked. "Are they?" "No." And the whole thing was like someone's evil joke on a bad dream. Helen had never liked sarcasm so arrogantly, sometimes snapped at teenagers smoking outside the house if she made a remark to them. And now her own husband is talking to her like that. "Benjamin, where's the money? Did you lose your wallet? Where have you been?" Jesus, already in tears, probed Helen through his pockets. "I won't tell," Benjamin said with a smirk. His eyes were cloudy and almost crazy. He looked at his wife with a look of menace, as if she were a hunted animal, and then he looked at her as if she were a helpless bunny who had met a wolf. At that moment, she felt like a helpless bunny who had met a wolf. She staggered backward, but Benjamin kept coming and coming, and there was clearly nothing good in his eyes. "Are you scaring me, Benjamin?" whispered Helen, slowly backing away. Suddenly, the drunk Benjamin snapped his teeth, as if trying to mimic an animal that wanted to bite its prey. Helen instantly shivered and ran screaming into the bedroom. The mad rich man's husband galloped after her. Before she could close the door, Benjamin knocked her down and she collapsed to the floor. Helen experienced unbearable pain. "That's my money yard wench," Benjamin shouted, "and I'll use it as I please. If you're going to search me, you're nobody here. If I didn't bring food to the house, you don't deserve it." As Helen rolled over forcefully, she immediately received another kick, this time in the stomach. Benjamin would have continued beating her if she hadn't stabbed him with her foot as well. In response, not expecting this, he shrieked and fell down. Taking this chance, she ran out of the room and then out of the apartment. Helen didn't turn around. She just ran like a wounded animal, as far away as she could get, but soon grew tired. She stopped only when she reached the streetcar stop, making sure no one was chasing her. She sat down, breathing heavily on the bench. Her stomach ached terribly. It all seemed like some kind of delirious nightmare dream. But unfortunately, it was happening in reality. Helen could not believe that Benjamin had changed so much, that such a kind and considerate man could become a drunkard, who beat his wife, who drank all the money he had left, screaming and threatening her with violence, paying out all her tears. She fearfully vowed to go home. There was nowhere else for her to go. Staying outside at night was also very scary. She hoped Benjamin was asleep by now. If not, he was sober and sorry for what he'd done. She quietly opened the front door, took the heavy statue from the nightstand, and walked slowly into the bedroom. Fortunately, her prayers had been answered. Her husband was already wheezing on the bed without even taking off his outer clothing. Helen decided not to take any chances and lay down on the couch in the living room. This night was the most difficult for the girl, but still she managed somehow to fall into a jagged and not strong sleep. When she awoke the next morning, she did not see Benjamin. The bed was neatly made, as if he hadn't been there. Helen wondered if she had gone crazy or dreamed it all, but then she saw the tattered shirt on the floor beside the bed and the broken vase beside it, and concluded that it had all happened for real. And she wanted to wake up and see the usual sight of her favorite man, who was going to work, and cheerfully asked what tie he should wear. Now there was none of that. Only the devastation and pain from the injuries when she got up from the couch and walked past the mirror. She saw her horrifying reflection under the eye was a huge bruise on her arms and legs. The abrasions in her stomach still pulled and ached. Just today, she planned to go to the Women's Counseling Center, where she had registered for pregnancy. Of course, the doctor would ask about the nature of her bruises and abrasions. It took her a long time to come up with something. Eventually, she was downgraded, put a Panama on her face. It looked strange. It was early fall, no time for summer Panamas. Slanted glances of passers-by were certainly ensured, but after the reception, she no longer cared about aesthetics and the opinion of others. What she heard turned her world upside down right out of the office. She was taken away by ambulance with a miscarriage. 2 days later, she went home in tears. She didn't even see the sympathetic or perplexed looks of passers-by. Alone with her grief, Helen paid no attention to the world around her. She didn't want to go home either. Her husband didn't even look for her, didn't even call the clinic when she was asked who she could call and where her husband was. She had lied to the doctors that he was on a long-distance business trip. Weeping Helen sat down on a bench in a strange yard. All around, someone's kids were playing ball and climbing on various rungs. Their happy mothers, grandmothers, and babysitters were watching them. But for Helen, the mere sight of someone else's child caused a storm of negative emotions. Self-pity, despair, anger. Some young girl sat down with a stroller very close by and slowly rocked it, smiling at her thoughts. All the happiness of the world seemed to gather in that place, which now would never be available to Helen. After a time, the account of which she had lost, a woman in her 60s came to sit on the bench. She looked rather ordinary, but in her eyes shone worldly wisdom and sympathy. "Don't grieve, my dear," asked this unfamiliar woman. Helen reluctantly looked up at her from beneath Helen's tears. A cold, emotionless stranger's face looked at her, or was it just her imagination? After all, the only person sitting in front of her now was the only person who had inquired about her condition. She'd lost the baby. Helen answered in a quiet, trembling voice. "Oh, my dear, how old is he? Did you go to the police?" the woman asked sympathetically. Helen looked at her perplexed and then realized her mistake. Probably, this phrase sounded as if the child was just lost. "No, I expressed myself incorrectly. It died before it was even born." Helen hid her face in her palms. The woman sitting next to her was also embarrassed by this answer. She clearly felt embarrassed by her inadvertent and tactlessness. "Today recognized with a note of sadness and sympathy?" inquired the stranger. "Yes, but Helen could not finish. She was overwhelmed by feelings again. She cried right in front of this clear-headed woman. She moved closer and put her arm around the poor girl's shoulders. "Come on, sweetie, come on, come on. Calm down," she said, soothing Helen, stroking her back. "God always sends us trials. Everyone has grief. How many people die every day? How many mothers lose their children? Are you not alone in your grief? All I wanted was simple maternal happiness." Helen sobbed. "I asked for too much. Can you handle this grief?" The stranger assured her. "Will you have more children?" The doctor said I could never have children again. It was very hard for Helen to say those words. They cut her to the heart. It was still painful. The tears could not be stopped. Today she was just killed in her life. There was no more meaning. And this stranger, she wanted so badly to help, but Helen realized that no one could do it. It was the will of the Almighty. Finally she cried, and more or less calmed down, thanked this beautiful woman and left. She went home. The way was long, but this time gave her a chance to reflect on the whole situation. Outside the cold, this fall cloak to her was no longer saving her. She had passed by happy couples many times, and it wasn't the jackets or the cloaks that warmed them. They were warmed by a love that she didn't have now. She was completely broken. As she walked across the bridge, she stopped, paused, and stared off into the distance. There were people walking past her, lots of people, but it was as if she didn't see them. Tears were streaming from her eyes. She was completely devastated. This hole in her heart just kept growing. And suddenly a terrible thought came into her head. She would never do such a thing. But then again, what was keeping her in this world? No love, no joy, no money. She didn't want to rot under a lamppost somewhere, begging for alms. She always wanted to just live. Wasn't she worthy of that? Was it getting dark? There were fewer and fewer people on the streets, and Helen stayed where she was. Leaning on the iron bars, she already wanted to just jump, take it and jump, and the torment would be over. But then she changed her mind. Whether it was animal instinct or some desire to live that saved her. That conversation with the woman on the bench had something to do with it. People died, people always die. How many children lost their parents? How many mothers lost their children? But they didn't give up. They didn't stand on the bridge thinking about ending their lives. They fought for happiness, for love. Helen's mom always taught her to fight. You don't get anything in this life, just like that. You have to fight, and then you can achieve anything. Helen was afraid of her own thoughts. She stepped away from the iron railing and then rushed away from that bridge. She was afraid she would change her mind. She was afraid she would fall off. Already at dusk, Helen approached her house. She hesitated at the front door for a long time, hesitating whether to go or not, but she pulled herself together as quietly as yesterday and entered the apartment. As she passed the kitchen, she saw Benjamin sitting at the table. He was sitting alone, holding a glass of wine. His head was down, but as soon as he heard her footsteps, he looked up at her. He threw an appraising glance at her, where he was messing around, brought out his state by a completely drunken voice. To the doctor she walked uncertainly like a mouse, said Helen to the doctor. And I wasn't allowed to say. Aha, raised Benjamin's voice. The woman was still standing in the doorway, afraid to move. At any moment she was ready to run. This screaming was frightening her a lot. Have you been gone since this morning? I mean, your husband disappeared and you went to the doctor instead of looking for him. Benjamin got up from his chair and slowly approached Helen. But she didn't even move. She was so offended by his tone that she remained standing with her head held high until the last moment. Finally, he came up to her and stood close to her. And shame on you, his husband hissed, his breath smelling terrible. Every breath he exhaled was accompanied by the smell of alcohol and cigarettes. No, Helen answered firmly, looking her teacher straight in the eyes. But in the next moment, something absolutely terrible happened. Benjamin slapped the woman on the cheek with such force that she almost collapsed to the floor. She immediately grabbed her face with her hand, which was burning with pain. Benjamin took her by the chin, turned her face toward him, and ordered her to look into his eyes. I'm sick of having a wife like that. Scuffle the hell out of who the hell you're messing around with. What other doctor? Answer me. He shook her by the shoulders with force. The woman was proudly silent. That's when Benjamin hit her again. This time Helen could not resist and fell down. Answer me, you bitch, Benjamin yelled. I went to see the midwife. I wanted to know what was wrong with our baby. In tears. Poor woman's baby. Yes, Benjamin, we had a baby. Why did you? In a stern tone, but without shouting. The man asked. I had a miscarriage. I can never have children again. Helen caught a glimpse of my regret in her husband's gaze. But then he put on the mask of an indifferent host again. It wasn't my child. Really, you just got knocked up and wanted to blame it on me. How can you say that, Benjamin? In total shock, Helen moaned. I said it wasn't my baby, and thank God it's gone. You're a terrible mother, an unworthy wife, and a worthless woman. He went back to screaming. Benjamin's not crying. Fool, hissed the man. I don't want to see you. After these words, he went into the corridor, took his coat, and went out, banging the door loudly. Helen was once again left alone in utter despair and incomprehension. What should she do next? How to live? What to live on? It was a total collapse of everything. She had already realized the fact that her husband no longer had any tender feelings for her, but why? What caused such an abrupt change? Was it only the loss of her job? And the powerless woman rose slowly. She went into the bedroom. Everything was just as it had been in the morning. She picked up her favorite crystal vase, or rather, all that was left of it. And after all, this thing had been inherited from her mother, or even her mother. But Helen had suffered too much loss during that day. She emotionally folded the fragments into a large handkerchief, tied it up to make something like a pouch, and put it on the dressing table. Maybe someday she'd find the strength to glue it back together. The woman realized that Benjamin was gone for the night, and without fear of anything, went to bed, expecting a new day, another day that would bring her nothing but misery. But she fell asleep surprisingly quickly. After all the nightmares she had experienced, her body needed rest. The morning was just as painful and gloomy. Helen had a headache, but that wasn't what woke her up. Someone was banging loudly on the door. It must have been Benjamin. He'd lost his key, and now he was banging on it. The woman stood up and threw on her robe. She walked slowly to the door as someone pounded on it, like they wanted to break it down. I'm coming. I'm coming. Helen answered in a hoarse voice. She turned the key and removed the chain from the door, but there was a completely different person behind the door. Hello, Helen. The woman said hello and entered the apartment without asking, but she didn't need permission. It was the landlady, Nina. What's wrong with you? You look really bad." The landlady looked at her, studying her, which made Helen embarrassed. Without waiting for an answer, Nina went into the kitchen. While looking around the room for order, Helen ran to the mirror in a panic. There was more than just a black eye on her face now. One cheek was swollen from last night's blow, and the other had a huge, fresh scratch on it. Now she had to come up with some excuse for her horrible appearance. Helen tried to look as independent as possible and went into the kitchen. The owner was sitting at the table. As soon as Helen entered, Nina immediately turned to her. "Is there something wrong with you?" Concerned, asked the hostess. Helen sat down, across from her, without removing the smile from her face. She hoped it looked more or less natural. "Oh, you have no idea, Nina. Yesterday I was hanging the curtains and I fell right onto the nightstand. It was a terrible bump. You must have been in the hospital," the woman asked incredulously. Of course, Helen smiled back. "Well, get well soon," Nina said with a hesitant smile. She was always such an understanding, kind woman. But when she came in, she asked tons of questions and wanted to get into all the details. And Helen even liked it. Her endless worries, but not this time. "Where's your husband?" "Benjamin at work, left recently," so also smiling, answered Helen. "He wasn't fired after all." "Excuse me," Helen's heart began to pound frantically. She's having a real panic attack. She knows someone's already seen it, but of course, she knows the world is full of rumors. No, she can't expect her to think they have no money at all. "But I heard from the neighbor downstairs that he was kind of fired." "I apologize if that's not true." Word travels fast, you see. That's exactly what Helen confirmed under your voice. "That's why I came by. I thought you were out of work. I was worried about the apartment." "I'm sorry about that." "It's okay, Nina. I understand." "Aha. Why did I come by?" "I just wanted to remind you about the payment." "I'll check in with you in a week, okay?" Of course, Helen answered as best as she could, pretending to be calm and happy. But there was a real storm raging in her soul. She saw her hostess off, then sat down at the round table, covered with a beautiful knitted tablecloth, and clutched her head. She had to think of something, to get the money, or they would be thrown out of the house. She wasn't even worried about Benjamin. To her, he was already as good as dead. She was worried about herself. She didn't want to live on the streets. She had to find some money somewhere. Helen decided to call the one person she trusted the most. It rang. Yes, Maria answered in a sleepy voice. "Maria, I'm sorry it's so early." "I know it's Sunday, but I'm in trouble," Helen said quickly. "So wait, stretched out her friend. The sound of lingering basing was heard. What happened? Already in a more cheerful voice, she inquired. Helen remained silent. She was so ashamed to tell her friend that she had no money, that her husband had practically abandoned her. After all, she was always bragging to Maria about her new clothes and accessories. A loving husband who gave her flowers every day. And now it's all gone overnight. Love is gone. Tomatoes are wilted. Is this where you pulled Helen out of her own sad thoughts? Maria's voice. Yes, Helen stretched out. She stirred a little again, but finally gave out. Can you lend me some money? Lend me some money? Asked her friend in surprise. I'm telling you, I'm having money problems right now. Maria was silent for a few seconds, but then she spoke again. Well, will you tell me later what happened? I can bring the money only on Friday. How much do you need? Okay, thank you, Helen answered in a guilty voice and said the amount. There was an awkward silence between them again. I hope you are well, Helen. Were you worried about Maria? Everything is better than ever. Helen lied in a cheerful voice. I just want to surprise Ben. I'll pay you back real soon. I promise. Maria snorted incredulously. They said goodbye and hung up. Helen was shaking again. She had never felt so helpless. Benjamin hadn't been home in 3 days. Helen was terribly worried, but she didn't try to look for him, knowing it would be useless. It would only get her into more trouble. She continued to play the role of good hostess to neighbors and acquaintances. And when someone asked about Benjamin, she told them he was away on a business trip. But what frightened her most of all was that Maria's money was extremely low. She would pay the rent once. And then what? She would have to look for a job. In the end, she decided to post ads at bus stops that she sews dresses and clothes to order, and 3 young girls came to her almost immediately. One needed to mend a torn holiday dress, another had to sew pants of a non-standard size, and the third fell off with meat button on a winter coat, and a hole appeared, which was gnawed by a mouse. The amount for the services is listed. Hortnitsa was much lower than the market price, so they turned to Helen. She immediately began to fulfill the orders, and the result was very pleased with the clients. She helped them a lot, and they were not stingy in their praise. The gratitude was generous. The girl with the dress paid even more than Helen had asked for. She marveled at the fact that there was not a trace of the defect left. The newly appointed seamstress was very proud of the work she had done and of her proceeds. If it continues like this, she will be able to live her life in peace. She would pay her debt to Maria and earn enough for a piece of bread. Friday came. Helen waited anxiously for her friend. She cooked a delicious dinner. How long had it been since she'd made one? After all, Benjamin never showed up. The money she received for her work was enough for normal groceries and other household expenses. Things were slowly starting to get better. Helen was even thinking about working for herself, opening her own corner of the house. Maybe get a second neck as a partner. The minutes were adding up to hours, and Maria was gone. But finally, the long-awaited doorbell rang. Maria came in high spirits. Here, she handed her friend an envelope with money and a box of chocolates. Helen couldn't help but be pleased with what she saw. Maria, thank you, darling, but why did you spend so much on chocolates? It's so expensive. It's nothing. Nothing is too much for a best friend. Maria laughed. I haven't seen you in 100 years. They sat down at the table, having made a good deal. The plates were covered with Koreko's appetizing pig for cookies and potatoes. Oh, Helen, it smells. Just marveled at the dish Maria served. Helen smiled embarrassedly in response, pouring red wine into the glasses. They drank a glass each. A little time passed and Helen's thoughts were already somewhat foggy. So why do you need money? Maria asked, quite reclined on his chair with a wooden back. You know, we got in trouble. Benjamin was fired from work in a distraught voice, answered Helen. Sober, she would hardly have admitted it. Please don't tell anyone about this. Maria raised her eyebrows. What happened? Where is he now? Helen shrugged indifferently. It was the second week since Benjamin had left her and he hadn't shown up since. Not dead. Concerned, her friend asked. And if they had, Helen reasoned, turning her wine glass to the light. She was very amused right now. It's a liquid that looks like dark wine. I know blood. What can I do? Len, it doesn't look like you. You know, Marisha, I've changed a lot all this time. The sound of the lock opening of the front door interrupted Len's sentence. She was immediately shaken. She started to panic so much that she dropped her wine glass. It fell and shattered. The dark liquid stretched in a stain across the small tablecloth, and the shards scattered around the kitchen with a clinking sound. Maria looked at her friend with a worried look, and heavy male footsteps sounded from the hallway. Oh, honey, you're here. Benjamin stretched out in a tired voice. He glanced at Maria and your girlfriend. Helen looked at him with eyes full of terror, as if torn from the inside. It felt as if her new peaceful life had just been crumpled up like a piece of paper and burned. Yes, there was a terrible dwelling in her chest. Either it was the alcohol or her husband's unexpected visit had had that effect on her. We can talk in the other room out of the blue for everyone, she suggested to Benjamin. He nodded silently with a nonchalant expression. Maria, on the other hand, felt as if she were watching a spectacle. She realized that there was some tension between them, that something terrible was going on between them. They retreated to the bedroom and Helen closed the door. What are you doing here? She whispered loudly. What am I doing here? Benjamin began to resent her. This is kind of my apartment, yes. And being gone for almost 2 weeks doesn't bother you at all. I hope you had a good time with your lover during that week. How did he take the news that you might be having a baby? What are you talking about? Ashhole. Helen's already started screaming. Maria, I heard some swear words and then some slap and splinters flying on the floor. Something heavy fell, and immediately everyone was silent. The silence seemed ominous. A chill ran down Maria's back. She was afraid to stay here. "Helen is very tired and decided to rest," said Benjamin, leaving the room and closing the door behind him. "Are you done having fun yet?" Maria looked at him with a slight smile. Her knees were trembling, but she tried to keep her expression perfectly calm. Benjamin, on the other hand, was very tense. It looked like he was also trying to hide his true feelings. Maria realized he was lying. Something terrible had happened to Helen, but if she asked him about it right now, she would be in trouble too. Benjamin repeated his question, and this time more insistently. "I was just having tea," Maria replied, "and we were hanging out." "What was that envelope?" Benjamin persisted. Maria looked at the envelope, which had been lying on the table all this time. Her neck was covered with sweat, but she tried not to panic. This would only hurt her. "I got an evasive note at work today," she said. "I'm going to be late. I guess I'll be going now." Benjamin looked at her with a look full of the strange expression that our children are friendly, he said. Maria got up from the table and went out into the hallway. Benjamin closed the door tightly, went back into the bedroom, and picked up Helen lying unconscious on the floor. She had been unconscious for several minutes. He heaved her onto the bed, removed the splintered, heavy plaster statuettes. Then he left and locked the room. Helen woke up as if in a delirium. The sun was really blinding her eyes. She looked around. After coming to her senses a little, the woman realized that she was in her bedroom. She vaguely remembered what had happened yesterday. Only the pain in her head was unbearable. She touched the places where it hurt the most and was very frightened. Feeling some kind of sticky liquid, carefully getting out of bed, she groaned in pain and proved to triumph on the back of her head under her hair. Felt a fresh wound along her neck, changed blood, clean marks. Now thoughts began to gather into one coherent picture. Where is Maria? What had he done to her? If he knocked her out, then it must mean that her friend was just as badly hurt. She immediately forgot about the pain and rushed to the door, but to her surprise, it was locked. No matter how many attempts Helen made, no matter how many times she pulled the poor handle, it was all in vain. She remained locked in. Her panic set in again. She sat down by the door and began to cry. Everything was going well until he showed up. That rascal had destroyed everything again. She hated Benjamin now. If he had been here lying drunk and helpless like he had been a few weeks ago, she would have strangled him for sure. But he wasn't here. And no matter how much she screamed for help, no one came. So far, she'd been sitting under the door all day. At times she was drowsy, having nightmares. She was already imagining things, that her husband was a maniac, that he would come back and kill her. And then she calmed down and came to the conclusion that these are just silly fantasies. He's not a maniac or a murderer, he's just a jerk and an alcoholic. Nothing more. It was already starting to get dark outside the window. The apartment was still quiet. Had he really left her here? Gone again for a week, but no, she had no intention of giving up. When she realized that no one could help her in this situation, she decided to act. What added fuel to the fire was not knowing what had happened to Maria. Benjamin was just nuts, which meant he could have done something terrible to her. Helen looked on his dressing table for the purchase. It was nowhere to be found. The woman was about to dismiss the idea, but at some point she saw the glitter show on the carpet. It was for Kolka the only thing that gave her hope of getting out of this nightmare. She pulled the sharp things away and put them in the keyhole. Helen had turned this trick once before as a child. Only then she'd been locked in an old closet. They were playing magicians, and Helen's task was to get out of the closet. Now the woman was slowly turning behind the deck, twisting it at different angles. And finally, she heard a triumphant click. The door was open. Helen was already prepared for any sight, but what she saw even upset her a little. She even felt a little ashamed of her fears. There was no one in the kitchen. Everything was perfect. Yesterday's food, bottle bags, and certainly not her friend's corpse lying on the floor. None of that was there. Helen looked around the room incredulously, walked around the table. No tricks she detected. And after all, her sick fantasy had already come up with dozens of variants of events. The woman imagined finding the bloodstain. The lack of water must have taken its toll on her. She was very thirsty, and a concussion couldn't be ruled out either. First, Helen drank 2 glasses of water, and then she wondered where everyone had gone. Benjamin had come over yesterday for a reason. He just didn't expect to see Helen in the company of a friend. Where had he been all these days? There were a lot of questions, but no answers. Then the woman remembered about the money, for Maria had brought an envelope. Where could she have put it? Helen began to search around the room. The balloon on the floor behind the sofa many times examined the shelves and closets. There was nothing anywhere. Could it be that Benjamin had stolen the envelope from her? That hunch startled her here as well. The woman noticed some small scrap on the shoe shelf. It could not be seen at once. It was very well hidden under Helen's shoes. She opened the package and read a note from Maria. It said, "Helen, there is no time to explain. Come tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at 87 K Street." This really stirred her up and, of course, scared her. Helen wondered what day it was, what date it was. What if she had spent more than one night unconscious? She glanced at the clock. It was already 3:30. If it was that day, she was well on time. After all, she only had to walk 2 blocks. That was where Maria herself lived. Helen quickly put on some clothes. She realized it would be impossible to hide all the marks of the beating. There would be too many of them to cover up the blood she'd drawn from Othello and covered up with her hair. It looked pretty harmonious, except for the bruises on her face. The long-bought dressy scarf finally came in handy. Tied it tightly around her head. Helen hid part of her face and the bruise on her neck. Although Maria quite already knew about everything, but other people should not ask unnecessary questions. Helen arrived at the address at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That one was a small courtyard between 2 houses, quite cozy. As she looked around, she heard someone shouting her name from behind her. It was Maria. She must have asked to leave work. Helen thought, after all, today was a normal weekday. Helen said Maria got closer and hugged her friend tightly. "I have 2 pieces of news for you and not very good. Let's go." She pulled Helen to the road, not giving her a chance to say anything. "As I began to tell you, I could tell from the look on your face that my guess was right. Maria was serious, but there's something you should know. Maybe it'll help you break up with your husband. Where are you taking me?" Perplexed, Helen asked. "You see, before I met you a few days ago, I saw something I probably shouldn't have seen. I didn't want to tell you as I was afraid it would ruin your marriage. But yesterday, I realized that it's already broken. It can't go any further. And I still can't understand why you lied to me, why you said everything was fine." Maria stared at her friend point blank. "I thought it was temporary, that things would get better. I was ashamed. I always bragged that I had such a good husband, attentive, generous. And you didn't like it yourself. When I told you about him, it didn't work out with Suryoga. What nonsense. Maria, I'm your friend first of all. And as your friend, I want to show you something or someone." They went into a dark alley and then out into an enclosed courtyard. Helen heard voices, but didn't get a good look at the people coming out of the building. Maria pushed her against the wall with force. Now all I had to do was watch from the corner. Terrible events were unfolding before her eyes. After a company of lively young people who were noisily talking walked past them, Helen saw Benjamin. He was standing near the fire escape with some young girl in a light-colored coat. They were chatting sweetly, laughing. Benjamin had an affectionate smile on his face. He had smiled once before, so Helen couldn't get a good look at the girl's face. Tears covered her eyes, but that was enough for her. Benjamin was cheating on her. It's obvious now. Who knows how long they have this going on, for a week, a month, a year. She knew what was going on. Why didn't she immediately realize that her husband was going to the left? Tears were streaming from her eyes, but she couldn't do anything to keep her sobs from being heard. She covered her mouth with her hand and watched the 2 lovebirds. "Dad, they've gone somewhere. I guess the aisle where Helen and Maria were standing wasn't the only one here. I saw them here for the first time one night. It was then that I had my first suspicions about your lies, Maria explained. After a few seconds of silence, I can't leave him. I'm nothing without him. I'll have to put up with his abuse and that mistress of his. I don't want to end up on the street, Helen said with pain in her voice and walked away. She ignored her friend's shouts. She returned home in a terribly depressed mood. She didn't feel like doing anything at all. It was at that moment that she felt like a defenseless, abandoned puppy. Benjamin never came back, but the worst part was that the envelope with the money was still missing. Tomorrow the landlady was going to come and demand payment for the money Helen had earned herself would not be enough, even if she had been given a huge discount. She did not understand why Benjamin was so neglectful of their shared household. Yes, he has a mistress, but he took so long to choose this apartment. He loves this place so much. Then why doesn't he make any attempt to find the money to pay for the apartment? But fate had prepared Helen with an answer to that question. Immediately, the front door opened and a couple in love appeared on the doorstep. Benjamin seemed to be having a lot of fun, as well as his companions. "Oh, Helen," the man exclaimed triumphantly. "Meet Kate." He introduced his mistress, Kate. "This is Helen, my ex-wife's ex-wife," vanished Helen. "Oh, well, that's just a formality. We'll sort it out later." Benjamin waved his hand and patted Helen on the shoulder. She was very indignant at this familial gesture, but said nothing. The words just stuck in her throat. "Make us something to eat. Kate and I are very hungry," the man said. Sits down at the table. Helen, in complete shock of indignation, lingered in the hallway and dialed her friend's number. While a muffled chuckle and whispered I came from the room. She waited patiently for the call to be answered. The beeps went on and on. No one picked up. The woman already wanted to reset, as here on the other end of the wire did pick up the phone. "He brought her here," cried Helen, who was the concerned voice of a friend. "Kate, that mistress we saw today, I can't take it anymore." "Helen, you said this through tears and sobbed languidly after every word you uttered." "Wait for me soon," my friend replied and hung up. Benjamin's heartless behavior was already out of line. Helen walked into the room, thumped loudly on the table, and gritted her teeth. "I've put up with your terrible attitude towards me for a long time, and you cheated on me on the side. And now you show up at our house and bring that bitch with you. And you demand that I feed you. First of all, it's not your house, it's mine." Benjamin answered calmly. "And don't forget I pay rent. And secondly, apologize to Kate and for your insults." "Yes, you are. The landlady's coming tomorrow, and you've drunk all the money. It's none of your business where I put my money. You apologize to Kate right now. I'm not going to humiliate myself in front of you. Bastard. You're not. That's right. What are you going to do? What do I need you for? You don't cook, you don't work, you don't clean. We don't have kids either. Why are you here? Are you just taking up space for me?" Helen was so enraged by these bitter and terrible words, said so cruelly to her face, the dearest and closest person she had ever had, that she couldn't say a single word back. If I snapped right now, I'll be the only one worse off. Feverishly, she calmed herself in her thoughts. Then she sat quietly in her chair and waited for Benjamin's reaction, for what he would say, what he would do. "You're just going to sit there?" After a while, her husband inquired. Helen still did not answer anything. She just looked at him with a glare. She really wanted to punch him. She wanted to hit him so badly. For all the humiliation and beatings, for the death of their child, for everything he had done. "I'm gonna go wash my hands. And you ladies, get acquainted," Benjamin finally announced and went into the bathroom. Not a minute later, a terrifying hatred erupted between Helen and Kate. Helen smirked smugly and fixed her immaculate hair. "Don't offer her a drink," she asked the hostess snidely. Helen couldn't stand it any longer and pounced on the guest who hadn't been abandoned. Both of them fell on the floor and there was such a mess. Helen started kicking. Rival gained Janina from behind Vita's hair, and the latter was screaming with all her might and fighting back, scratching like a cat. Suddenly, someone's warm, familiar hand touched Helen and began to pull her away from Katya. "Helen, stop unhooking, you're already off her," shouted Maria, trying to pull her friend away. Helen was getting really hysterical. She owed her whole body and let go of her victim. Maria sat her down on the floor, a safe distance away from Katya, who and rushed from the restroom infuriated Benjamin. The mistress immediately began to complain to him about Helen crying and smearing brightly colored lipstick on her cheeks. "Out of my house," hissed Benjamin, narrowed his eyes. The sight of him did not bode well for Helen, so frightening and cruel. Was that her own husband? Which was all Helen could manage to utter. But Benjamin interrupted her again. "I said get out of my house immediately, or I'll call the police, and you'll be in trouble for this assault." Helen looked at Maria, hoping to find support in her gaze. But even there she saw only fear and incomprehension. "Benjamin," I tried to speak up again, but her husband was completely unwilling to listen to her. He was hugging his darling Kate, who obviously had very good acting skills. She was crying pitifully, though she had not been in pain for a long time. And when Benjamin was not in sight, she was smiling at Maria with Helen the most triumphant grin denoting, "Here, I have won you over." It had been a full 3 days since Helen had left the beloved home she had lived in for so long. She had been taken in by her faithful Maria for a while. She lived in much more modest conditions, but for now it was the only option available. "You know, Maria," she started, "I've just realized that this Washington is not for me. I can't live in such a big city full of lies and betrayal. Everyone's a stranger here. Even the neighbors don't care about you. How can you do that?" I remembered that my grandfather had a house somewhere, either in Tula or near Ryazan. I only went there a couple of times when I was a child. It's a very remote village, so nobody bothers me there anymore. Maria listened to these thoughts with a sip of tea and replied mockingly, "You're implying that you want to go to your late grandfather's house." "Yes, and I even have the keys. My mother gave it to me before I left, and maybe I'll look there sometime. But it didn't work out, as you can see, and now. But you know, I think it would be a good solution. I'll take care of the animals at the collective farm. I'm not used to it. I'll tell you my life sometime. And your mother." "What are you saying? I won't go back to her? No, no way. The whole village would eat me up and tear me to pieces." Helen felt a twinge at the clear picture, and on her back ran nasty goosebumps. After thinking everything over, her friend agreed with her arguments and even helped her with packing. Helen didn't have much of her own stuff. Benjamin had given half of it to his new mistress. Getting ready for a long trip, Helen rummaged through Maria's closet, where some of her clothes were kept, and suddenly noticed a familiar variegated fabric, her exit dress. She stopped in a complete stupor. Helen was very meticulous in this respect, and never gave her belongings to a friend. How did it get in here? She looked around. But there was definitely a tiny little hole here. It got caught on the merry-go-round in the park. Turned it back on the lining. What was that for? Oh God, really? It was only then that the whole picture came together in her head. It was a new stab in the back. She decided to wait for her friend to get home from work, so she could ask her friend point blank. She sat like a statue in the kitchen and stirred her tea with a spoon, having left it long ago. Finally, a lively Maria, Helen appeared on the doorstep. "I'm home," she said, smiling, taking off her coat in the hallway. "Why are you sitting here like this?" she asked, surprised, raising an eyebrow at the sight of her friend. An expression on her face that was utterly detached, and the lead actress returned sarcastically, Helen Maria uttered in response. She frowned with a perplexed look in her eyebrows, but as she stepped closer, she saw the very dress in her friend's hands. Shame, annoyance, and anger mingled on her face. It was as if time had stopped. "I have to admit, you're a very good actress. Too bad you're not a very good friend." Helen continued to speak in the same sarcastic tone. "I can explain." "You don't have to explain anything," interrupted her indignant Helen. "So everything is absolutely clear still. It is Kate girls. But how well you both played. Stanislavski's resting. And Benjamin, he's a real sweetheart. Len, I know you're mad right now, and you went to see him, right? And you didn't go to what? You quit your job a long time ago." Yes, yes, panic," Maria answered in a noisy voice. "And how long have you had it?" "A few months. Listen, I already do not care what and how there you have joined, With bitterness fell Helen, right? In general, I just hurt from the betrayal of my best friend, the only person I really trusted. How could you? We grew up together. Wait a minute, please. Let me at least explain. Benjamin and I planned this a long time ago. We fell in love with each other. Well, that happens. I'm sorry. At first, we didn't even want to think about it. Then what was supposed to happen happened, but we still kept it a secret. But then we realized we couldn't live without each other. We just couldn't. But you have to understand that, Elaine. That's when we came up with this plan. I don't claim it's right. It's a warning. It raised Maria's hand, and many points Benjamin violated. He had to come to you and claim he'd been fired from his job, which of course never actually happened. I tried to spread rumors about it in your house to put you off your guard, to make you think it was true. It worked at first. We kept seeing each other discreetly, but then something went wrong. Benjamin went ballistic, yelling that he was sick of it and you wouldn't leave. And we need to get real, you know? You always bragged about your smart and energetic husband. Is that all true? But he also happens to be monstrously violent. Can't you see that? Shivering, Helen said and stared intently into her former friend's eyes. Well, what about my child? Doesn't that embarrass you too? What kind of person are you anyway? Are you both disgusting? She shouted and jumped up from her seat, breathing heavily. Let her nodded so nonchalantly Maria and sat back down to the table. Took out and sported a cigar, a thin cigarette, smoked it, and let out the smoke. And you, my dear, turned out to be as dumb as a cork and impossibly stubborn. You have to endure so much humiliation. So to finally evict you, I had to involve a real prostitute. She graduated from acting school, but the theater didn't work out for her, but she does have some talent. She really managed to convince you that she was your husband's mistress. After that, you were bound to go somewhere else. We didn't plan to tell you about us to avoid hurting you more. Do you understand? I still wanted to be your friend, but you figured it out. A friend. Helen asked in a heartbreaking voice, "Are you serious?" "Yes, really?" Helen exclaimed. "Your Benjamin, by the way, is not a gift, and I realized that very well at your wedding. Don't look at me like that and pull your eyes out. He can't miss a single skirt, and you're a knave fool. Who are you? Wait a minute, thank you. You can tell me that you finally got rid of him. I am. I just can't help it." She said it quietly and covered her face with her hand. "I'm sorry you had to find out like that. I'm sorry. I've packed my things and I'm leaving." Helen replied in a low voice, "Goodbye. God will judge you. I hope that fate will not bring us together again." 2 large bags were waiting for her at the front door. All that was left of the former, seemingly so reliable and settled life. Alan shouted blankly, and Maria wanted to add something. She ran to the door, but it slammed forcefully in her face. And Helen disappeared, leaving her former best friend to suffer and suffer from the remorse of her own troubled conscience. The train station she arrived at was too early. She had to wait until 5 o'clock, but Helen could easily bear it. Big deal. Trouble. She slept most of that time on a hard chair in the waiting room. Then she drank tea in the cafeteria, ate a stale cabbage pie, and went out on the platform of the field, crossed the suburbs, and further on through the dark forests and desolate autumn plains. The train carried her away, shepherding her wheels. Helen sat by the window, propped her head up with her hand and watched what would happen to her now, how she would live, what she would do. How to forget everything that had happened, how to erase from her soul the enchanting memories of her recent happiness. When the train stopped at the platform she needed, some attentive, smiling guy helped her carry her heavy bags. He's not cheating either. Helen thought bitterly. Thanks to him for his help now, it was only necessary to get a hitchhiker to take her to the place. This enterprise, which had appeared to be her most difficult task, turned out to be, on the contrary, very easy. There was a middle-aged man driving an old truck from the station. He was on his way, so he decided to help. A cute and tired woman. "I'll get in from there myself. Do not be afraid," he encouraged his doubting traveling companion. "We don't let our own get hurt. Where are you from?" After a short silence, asked the driver when they drove away from the station a decent distance from Washington. "Embarrassed," answered Helen. "Why did you leave?" "Circumstances were such." They rode in silence for the rest of the way, only occasionally asking simple, short questions, and Helen always answering in a single word. Finally, they reached the village. Helen thanked the driver and even wanted to give him money, but he refused, explaining that good deeds are not paid for. They are just done gratuitously. She thanked him once again and jumped out of the cab and walked along the street with her bags. But it didn't take long to walk. Looking up, she saw a vaguely familiar house. "Are you the floral sign with the number?" It left no doubt as to its identity. More than anything else, the house looked like a floor rotted away. An abandoned big barn. Used to be a pretty nice house. Her great-grandfather had built this house with integrity in his day. But even the best things come to an end. Her maternal uncle was the last one to live here. Her mother moved into her husband's house when she got married, and her grandfather and grandmother and youngest son always lived here. Their garden was very good. Cherries, pears, plums. There were also apple trees near the house, and there were even traces of made beds. The gray, gnarled planks had rewarded high and rich streaks, but now only weeds grew on them. Of course, it would all have to be rebuilt. There's no man's hand, and it'll take a lot longer to do it myself. But what can you do? Helen wandered around the abandoned vegetable garden for a long time and considered her territory without entering the house itself. Behind the fence, she saw a neighboring plot, clean and well-maintained. Moving closer, Helen considered the woman, picking a later pear from a tall tree, but seemed to notice her presence as well, and turned around. Hello to the neighbor. She stretched out, climbing down from the wooden stepladder. She shakily wiped her hands, their mastered and front ones. She looked like the most genuine Russian village woman, quite full. Slack off and paper bandage on her head with red counters, with plump lips. Large gray eyes looking friendly and attentive. She looked about 45 to 50 years old. "And you, in fact, who were you come with the previous owners?" "I am Helen. This is my late grandfather's house," explained the newcomer. The neighbor nodded, but said nothing more and went back to minding her own business. Helen only shrugged her shoulders and decided to finally go inside the house. The inside looked a little better than the outside. Hard wooden floors, a chest of drawers, beds, kitchen utensils. However, there was a lot of cleaning to be done. There was dust everywhere. Dirt smelled of stale grayness and mice. First, Helen found some logs in the barn and lit the stove. At first, there was a puff of smoke, and she thought the chimney was blocked and nothing would come out. But then she slapped herself on the forehead, laughed, and hurriedly made a sad damper. She had completely forgotten how to manage the household. She was ashamed of herself. Now the fire finally flared up properly, and the house gradually began to warm up. Autumn was already quite cold, so it was necessary to prepare thoroughly before night. In general, before city life, she had been very good at this kind of housekeeping, so she had no trouble with the overhanging cobwebs and the black flakes of soot. She was well aware that she was unlikely to cook anything good today, so she bought a sandwich in advance at the train station. This was to serve as her dinner tonight. For scrubbing floors, drinking, washing, and cooking, she needed water. Of course, here it came from a well. Fortunately, it was very close to Helen's new home. She could see it as she walked down the street. Coming out of the gate with a bucket found in the hay, she went straight to the well pipe and was about to dip it into the bucket when suddenly she heard someone's distinct drowning sound. Having grown up in exactly the same conditions, Helen didn't doubt it for a second. A wolf was howling, of course, but not so close to a fairly populated village. It wasn't even dark yet. It was very strange. She stood for half a minute, anxiously, gazing into the thickening dusk. Then chillily, she shrank back, shook her head, and putting the bucket on the ground, took up about the gate. And then right from the well, from the distant depths, came a pitiful squeal. And now, as if in response to this sound again howled nearby. Helen's wolf went cold inside. What in God's name is going on here? She thought with fear. The thin whimpering sounded again and again. And at some point it ended with the same, in general, tearing cord, only very, very weak and sorrowful. And then it came to Helen that somehow a wolf cub had fallen into the well, and its unhappy wolf mother was howling nearby. Helen by nature had a good heart and instantly took a not the most understandable villager. She decided to save the poor cub by all means. Several times she lowered the bucket attached to the well on the chain of the heavy gate, but all was to no avail. The wolf cub either couldn't get into it or she lowered it. The bucket wasn't deep enough, but his crying subsided. "What are you doing here?" Suddenly a voice from behind made her shudder with her whole body trying to get out of the well. Volchenko answered, reluctantly, seeing her neighbor, the one who was picking pears in the afternoon. She was amazed. "He's whining here. He'll probably drown soon." "Upset," said Helen. "And somewhere nearby his mother drives." "Yes, we heard." The neighbor said grudgingly, "I'll tell my husband to bring a gun and shoot him. It's a wolf brat." "No," Helen jumped in. "I'll get him now and let him run to his mother." "Where'd you get the heart?" "You got a neighbor from the city with a moose on the side of the road." "From the city," nodded Helen, trying to give her face an independent and confident expression. Her neighbor was teasing her. "It's obvious that you're not thinking straight. Where is this scene? He's alive and very small." In despair shouted Helen and cried. She stood in front of that woman, sobbing, and unable to stop. "How can you do that?" "He is just a little baby," shaking shouted out. Every now and then she, "But you wench is quite bad, as I see it," shook his head, frowned the neighbor, turned and left. And Helen was left alone again and stubbornly again, and again dipped the bucket to the farthest depth. Strangely enough, she heard no splash of water as she did so. At the same moment, when she realized this fact, the neighbor appeared again with some important object in her hand. "Not take," she held out to Helen. "Take from the chain a bucket and windings. And this old basin with the chain. See, it has handles. The bucket is tall. There's no way he can get into it. That's it." She was helping Helen, who was quite confused by this unexpected help. "The well is long gone. There's no water there. We don't take water here. We go to Cheремkovo and Gorky over there." She waved her hand to the left. "That's what you'll get, once you get the hang of it. In the meantime, my husband, the twig will bring you something else, but take your beast." The beast was a terribly thin, shivering, wet wolf cub. Not quite as small as Helen had thought, but more like a nondescript ankle. He'd folded up all over himself with fear as he was hoisted upstairs in an old, rusty basin. As soon as this makeshift boat neared the edge of the well, the wolf cub leaped abruptly onto the grass and skipped with all his might toward the darker forest edge, a short, angry one. On the run, quite like a puppy at play, laughed the neighbor. "No matter how much you feed the wolf, and in our case, no matter how much you help, he still wants to gallop into the forest. Let's go." She lightly poked, as if stunned in the neck and the side. "We'll give you some water for the first time and something to chew on." Helen obediently walked beside Wendy. That was the woman's name, and took from her hands the old basin in which they used to lift animals from the well to help and carry them home. Wendy's the house turned out to be very cozy. Embroidered curtains variegated half a real Russian hut. When they heard the door to the big half open, two small children, looking like yearlings, came running out. They were about 5 or 6 years old at most. Their mischievous laughter and shining eyes made Helen's heart clench with pain. Overpowered herself, she smiled broadly. "What cute babies you have." However, her neighbor's reactions dismayed her. "Anya, get out of here," Wendy said threateningly to the kids. They noisily rushed away. "You sit down." "Now I'll pour tea," already quite friendly, said the woman, addressing Helen. "These are my grandchildren. My daughter's mother died of cholera soon after her second birth, and her husband left her. So it turns out they're orphans. But my husband and I are trying to bring them up to be real decent Soviet people." With a challenge, said Wendy, staring intently at her guest. Only nodded in response, automatically agreeing with this statement. Then the front door opened again and William, the same truck driver who had driven her to the village this afternoon, entered the house. Who's who? Helen certainly didn't expect to find him here, and he seemed surprised, too. Wendy saw their crossed glances and asked the logical question, "Did you two know each other already?" "But I gave her a ride from the station today," William laughed. The woman smiled affectionately. "I hope he didn't understand you." With her endless chatter, she asked ironically. Helen only negatively helped her head from side to side and smiled as well. She still felt out of place. At first, Wendy had seemed to her a callous and formidable woman. But the affectionate tone with which she had just addressed Helen, and especially her help with Volchenko's treatment of the abandoned well, had inspired the young woman with some inexplicable feeling of security. And that tenderness with which she looked at her husband. They certainly loved each other, and Helen envied their relationship. It seems that not everyone has such happy marriages. Perhaps it was the exception rather than the rule. In the meantime, a steaming plate with simple country food, boiled potatoes with butter and dill, was placed in front of her. Nearby, the hostess put a jar of mushrooms, a cut slice of coarse black bread salt, and to the market with milk called, and the children sat down at the common table. All began to dine. After she was given a fragrant tea with the smell of meadow herbs and collected a whole basket with different products, Helen almost cried again. "I don't have anything to pay you for yet. You don't need anything." Wendy waved her hands. "Don't give me that. We're neighbors now. In time, you'll help us in any way you can." And from that, she pointed carelessly at the basket. "We won't be poor, falling asleep this evening in our hastily read." But still not about that old new house. Helen thought with gratitude that he had not made a mistake with his decision to move from the capital to a remote village. After all, the people here are so nice and helpful. Running, the days added up into weeks, and Lenia was slowly settling in at the new place. Wendy and her husband helped her a lot to tidy up the house. Now it was possible to spend the winter without fearing the vagaries of harsh weather. Helen often babysat Wendy's babies in gratitude for her help, which she had to go out for a little while. Of course, the villagers were interested in the new dwelling, asking various questions why she had come here. But she was not eager to share her shameful story with the world. Her legal husband had kicked her out of the house, and his mistress turned out to be her best friend. No, it was a very embarrassing thing to tell people. So Helen answered everyone that she was bored with life in the city, as if she lived there only for a good job. And when she lost it, she decided to settle here. Few people believed this version, but they didn't show it. Almost all the neighbors turned out to be very friendly, like Wendy and William. A lot of people helped in any way they could. One elderly man even gave her a young goat. Nice little goat. They gave her extra chicks from their old uterus, shared their food. In general, the whole world tried to help the new girl. One day, Wendy came to her with absolutely wonderful news. The collective farm needed another milkmaid. The previous worker had married and left to her husband in another village. They didn't pay anything in money, only marked labor days. Yes, they allocated flour, groats, and some other products to the workers. But there was nothing to choose from. Helen worked like everyone else, and in the evenings she sewed beautiful dresses from thin line cloth, a large stock of which she found in her attic. She also sewed for a neighbor for a small in-kind payment of hay for the goat, groats, for the chickens, and fresh eggs. She had no eggs of her own yet. Little by little, the new life began to get better. Helen felt she could go on living, to live like everyone else. Sometimes on dark winter evenings, she missed the city, of course. Her old life. It was the place where she had spent her best young years. It was where she had once been so happy, where she had experienced true love and true betrayal. But all things work out for the best. Accordingly, Helen now existed accordingly. Gradually, she began to forget about her ruined marriage, about Benjamin, about her heavy disappointment. But it was very hard to forget her unborn child and Maria. After all, she had been her best friend since she was a little girl, almost a sister. They grew up together, moved to the city together, always served as a support for each other. And suddenly, such a betrayal. On her part, the pain didn't subside. But time passed. The scars healed and everything gradually faded into the realm of distant memories. And the winter that year was really severe, and more often wolves began to attack livestock. A calf was torn apart here. A goat was torn apart there. In the neighboring village, even horses were attacked right in the stables. If it goes on like this, people will starve. There was talk of raids. Concerned villagers began to organize night watches. One clear, frosty morning, Helen heard a loud knock on her door. Standing on the doorstep was Wendy in tears. "What's the matter?" Helen was worried. Come in quickly. I got out of bed this morning." The neighbor began in a trembling voice. "As usual, first thing I go to check my animals. I fed the bone, checked the hens. I got to my piggies. But what I saw, Helen, honestly, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. My piglets. I mean, every last one of them was gnawed to death by some unfit critters. Now I don't know what we are going to eat next winter." A few hours later, the news spread all over the neighborhood that the 2 fatal wolves had slaughtered every last one of them in the state. And the question of defending one's farm became more acute than ever. "Comrades," a man standing on a bench outside the clubhouse shouted as there was an unimaginable noise and commotion in the stands. Everyone was discussing the recent news that not only Wendy and William had suffered from the wolves' attack. Many people had lost chickens, goats, and even cows in the surrounding villages. A general panic was brewing. "Comrades, I beg you, let's discuss everything calmly," called the speaker, trying to shout over the raging crowd. "What kind of calm?" shouted some woman. "Our cattle are being slaughtered. Soon we'll be without pants. We must destroy these creatures as soon as possible. Let's raid." Chaos and heated discussion began again in the crowd. Many agreed with the woman. If nothing is done, most likely the villages nearest to the collective farm will be left without their main source of food. Everybody's everything. The man on the bench waved his hands again. "It's decided on Saturday. We'll announce a roundup of all those who can hold a two-way. Meet us at 4:00 a.m. at the clubhouse. Ropes, stakes, ammunition, and red flags will allocate the board." "Yay, let's go hunting," the crowd shouted with joy. "Let's give the gray creatures a piece of our minds." All as one left this impromptu meeting with happy faces. At last, the wolves would be destroyed. Every hunter was confident in his strength, and the women and children had great hopes for their men, who were going on the big hunt the day after tomorrow. As for Helen, her humble household, the wolf attack had so far bypassed her, so she was not particularly worried about herself. She only felt terribly sorry for the claymores of Russia. The morning of the roundup was overcast and damp. A sudden thaw had come over the villages and sat an evil gray blur in the early dawn and hour. Helen woke up with a heavy head and some bad feeling of having to go to work. For the morning twos, today was her shift. She had already gotten into the new routine and was used to getting up at such an early hour in Washington. At such an early hour, 10th dreams, people see with a chuckle, she thought, and hastily gathered herself, walked out of the house, shutting the door and turning around. Helen froze on the spot and almost fainted with horror. Right in front of her, across the porch, stood the very real live she-wolf with 2 wolf friends. The woman took large shivers, and her heart went to her heels. She stood pillar to post and couldn't move. Suddenly, the she-wolf sat down on her hind legs and gave a short howl. Suddenly, out of nowhere, another wolf cub came bending forward. He was smaller than the other teenage wolves, and somehow too complex for the fearsome predator. Just like the one I'd pulled out of the well, thought Helen, who knows? Maybe it was him. The wolf cub came very close, and waving his head, threw something gray and bloody right at Lennon's feet. It was the carcass for the soul of a young headless hare. Helen even laughed at the comicality of the situation. "Did you bring me a handout?" she asked with a grin, as if she hoped that the animals would answer her. The she-wolf, still sitting on the snow, stepped nervously with her front paws and looked at the woman straight in the eyes with too much begging, just like a pet dog. Well, Helen stretched out, thoughtfully. "I think I can help you today. Follow me." And she strode determinedly toward the barn. Without looking back, it was too scary to look back. What if he came at me from behind? But some inner feeling told Helen that no, it wouldn't. And the creatures came through the door, low down into the barn. And she said, "Wolf, the goat is still standing here. I don't have a cow yet. Don't touch my goat, or I'll give you to the hunters." I see. For a moment, Helen thought the gray men nodded. Their looks were so sincere and understanding. She slammed the barn door shut and wanted to close it, but for some reason she changed her mind, quickly put the decapitated rabbit in her heart, and ran to work. When Helen returned, the first thing she did was to go to the barn. The wolves were not there. She was already there. I thought the whole story was just a bad dream this morning. But the hare was still there. She went to check on her livestock. The goat and the chickens were alive and well, all in place by the score, so the wolves hadn't fooled her. Helen made an amazing roast with that carcass and invited the neighbors over. I'm coming home from work, and it's lying in the road like it's been dropped. And no head. She told Wendy and Vitaly, surprised by this unexpected treat. The hunters returned from the raid not very enthusiastic. The whole village welcomed them, old and small. It was interesting to look at the killed wolves. A mature male and several young ones had been shot. The roundups, the crates were explained in a businesslike manner. But no one even saw the older female, as if she had fallen through the ground, because she was gone. There must be, shook his head, the most experienced of Swimmer's wolf family always has the main mother wolf. Without her, the pack falls apart. Helen, standing together with everyone else in the crowd, had wisely kept silent about the wolves she was hiding in her barn. Of course, that would have been considered a real betrayal. And to be an outcast in the village to shelter her as a native was clearly not her cherished dream. A week later, the hunters gathered again for another roundup. Many women saw their husbands off in tears. After all, hunting wild animals is a dangerous business. Helen met a new morning. Again, she came face to face with a family of wolves in her vegetable garden. This time, the gray sly ones. They brought her 2 recently killed chickens. They're out of their minds. Hares are fine. But don't you dare touch the village chickens, or I won't shelter you anymore, threatened Helen. Hiding the wolves in the barn again. Where am I supposed to put these chickens now? And the old she-wolf, embarrassed and frowning. Think properly about your behavior. Helen declared to her and went into the house to pinch other people's killed chickens, to steam them, to salt them, to fill them with lard, and to put them away in the cellar for a rainy day. You can't just throw something like that away. February in the South was swirling, all the roads shoaled, but everything comes to an end. This long, cold winter is over. On the last day of February, Helen found at her door the last wolf's gift for a soulful partridge, and was surprised that this time they had brought her a wild chicken. Did they really get it? She was getting good at distinguishing her wolves now. In honor of having found him here in the old well on her first day, and a year later in the next winter roundup, a terrible tragedy happened in the village. One of the hunters accidentally shot his comrade, mistaking him in the morning twilight for a wolf Helen, who was quietly engaged in sewing in her kitchen. She was the first to hear the hoarse cry, jumped up and looked out the window. A large crowd had gathered outside Wendy and William's house. 2 strange men were dragging someone across the frozen ground. More and more people ran out into the street. Women stood in their nightgowns with chalks left on their shoulders. It was still dark from the kerosene lamp in their hands. Everyone was trying to figure out what was going on. Helen also got excited and ran out into the street. A familiar voice shouted, "Oh my God, Valera, Valera, Cheke." Someone else with a thin voice picked up, "What have you done, you fiends?" Suddenly, Helen caught a glimpse of her neighbor from the crowd. She was sobbing, screaming in a voice as if in terrible pain. Helen still didn't understand what had happened, and whose body lay in front of Wendy on a wooden stretcher. With her strength, she made her way through the crowd and saw the bloody body of William. Wendy bent over him in 3 dead bodies, screaming without ceasing, and then disappeared to the restless body of her husband and sobbed. So it seemed to Helen that she was about to give up herself. When Helen saw her, she threw herself around her neck and hugged her tightly, hugged her as if this young woman were the only thing in the world close to her. Wendy sobbed uncontrollably into Helen's shoulder. Some men lifted the body and carried it into the house. The crowd slowly dispersed. Helen stayed with the neighbors. She made Wendy some herbal tea, gave her a sedative, put her to bed, and sat by her bedside until she fell asleep. A paramedic came and registered the death, and after a while the body, which had been alive and warm a few hours ago, William was taken to the district morgue. Helen tucked Wendy in with her children and resumed her post by her older friend's bedside. At the funeral, Wendy did not utter a single word of Neva, cried not a single tear, only stared straight ahead with dry, sightless eyes, and left the cemetery, barely throwing the first dead earthy calm. At the coffin with the body of her husband, Helen did not follow her. She realized that any person needed to be alone at times like this. And Wendy now hated wolves fiercely. For when they brought home the luckless William, it turned out that on the day of the roundup, the wolves had suddenly burst through the flags and ran out in a pack. Just when the men were not prepared for it, they started shooting indiscriminately. And one such stray bullet hit Valera right in the heart. He was sitting on his room just at the place of the wolf's breakthrough. A whole month had passed since her husband's death, but Wendy was still walking around in a kind of trance. The sudden death of a loved one, the breadwinner of the family, had taken a toll on her. Helen tried to help her in every way she could. She invited her to visit, cooked meals, helped with the livestock, looked after the children. Wendy thanked her, but it was obvious that she was only concerned with all this insofar as she spoke very seldom and only about business. She stared into the void, her gaze unseeing. Every weekend, Helen watched her neighbor go to the village cemetery and weep at her husband's grave. She felt so sorry for this woman who had become almost family, and she did everything she could for her family, but she was unable to endure the pain for another. The wolves continued to attack villages and hamlets until spring, but much less often. The hunters managed to kill most of the pack, but Helen kept her little secret. She simply could not betray her gray friends. They were a great help to both her and Wendy's family. In such hungry times, Helen often felt remorse. After all, it appeared that it was she who was the cause of the misfortunes of the whole neighborhood, and even indirectly responsible for the death of Wendy, his husband. When she thought so, it was as if she were being thrown out of a bucket of ice water. So she tried not to think about it at all. The brought hares that the wolves regularly dragged in exchange for shelter, Helen used to give them to her neighbor. She knew she needed them more. All the while wondering where Helen got the hares from, the woman had to make up a story that she had learned to hunt on her own. Found 2 barrels in her grandfather's trunk, and now goes to the woods for game. But she asked Wendy to keep it a secret. Gradually, the neighbor began to withdraw from her great grief. Again, though much less often, her laughter was heard. In many ways, she was helped by her own children. They tried to cheer up the poor woman, all the time inventing entertainment for themselves and their grandmother, showing her puppet shows. Wendy and Helen applauded the young actors, often barely holding back tears. The hostess invariably recalled how she and her husband had given the very young grandchildren the same performances. When her Valera was still alive, it brought her terrible pain. But she had to hold on. After all, her husband would want the grandchildren to be all right, because it was their blood. Daughters, dear daughters. The late Valera loved them very much and always spoiled them. That candy from the city brings, that toy scolds. He was a great husband and grandfather. One warm July evening, Helen came to her friend's house quite late. A cricket chirped cozily behind the stove, and Wendy was looking at some old photos in the kitchen and smiling. The only light was a lit candle on the edge of the table, and Helen sat down carefully, so as not to frighten away that rare smile on the woman's face. The woman showed her her daughter in her wedding dress, and Focia next to her groom, and then her little grandchildren, talking about her with such love. After the death of their only daughter, Wendy and Valerie immediately took the little grandchildren to her. And you then, in your 35 about children, thought about children? Finally asked an entreating question Wendy. Of course, it very embarrassed Helen. She even almost told her the whole truth, how, in fact, her husband had deprived her of a child and then abandoned her. But she decided not to dissolve Nina and briefly answered, I cannot have children. Why didn't you take one from the orphanage? I have an acquaintance in a neighboring village suffered the same as you. She found a way out. She took in a boy, and now she's raising a healthy, handsome boy. He'll be 16 soon. Her mom calls her, loves her, helps her with everything. Helen only smiled warmly in response to this story. She didn't want to give away her opinion about the orphanages, or rather about the children. Very often children with bad genetics got there from such institutions. Born from God knows who, and from a child. As they say, no oranges are born. In general, the woman was absolutely against such a solution to her problem. Very often, as it seemed to her, such children grow up ungrateful. No matter how well you treat them, and no matter how you bring them up. The men were out hunting again today. Wendy changed the subject, and her voice faded noticeably. Wendy reached out sympathetically. Helen covers her hand with her palm. No, that's not what I mean. I've lived my grief. Everyone has a fate. It'll come to me one day. And even if it's in heaven, William and I will be together. You're a very strong man. The women talked about life and their experiences for a long time. Suddenly, Wendy was back on the subject. Hey, I remember you. You came here a long time ago. You were just a baby. With your girlfriend. I've lived here all my life. I know my neighbors. Such a pretty blonde girl. What's her Maria name? Helen helped. That's right. Where is she now? Are you still in touch with her? Oh no. We went our separate ways when we were kids. I haven't talked to her in a long time. So I have no idea what happened to her. Helen lied. Yeah, we used to be such good friends. Friendships fade, and eventually it's just you and your problems. Unfortunately, the way the world works now, you can't trust anyone. You were born alone and you'll go alone. That's right, that's right. The neighbor thoughtfully confirmed. Okay, summarized Helen. It's getting late. And tomorrow morning the women said goodbye, and Helen left the hut, which had become almost native to her. It was as if she had found a kindred spirit in the person of Wend. Back at her place, she realized she didn't want to sleep yet, and sat down on the porch with a mug of milk in her hands, sitting and enjoying the quiet summer night, looking at the stars and thinking about everything and nothing. Suddenly, a gray shadow slipped down the street and stood nearby, eyes glittering in the darkness. Is that you? Smiled Helen to her forest acquaintance. But how are you? Why are you here? The she-wolf came closer, and Helen saw that she was rounded. The dog sighed heavily, gray ravenously, pitifully just smoked and crawled almost to her very feet. Women amber eyes looked crane, tail, shrunk, and between the hind legs it is no way on the sheer. Marveled Helen. Come on, let's go. The she-wolf, realizing that this time she would not be chased away by lightning, threw herself into a familiar barn and closed in the lay, and Hayes sighed contentedly. I can't deprive my suffering mother of help. Quietly Helen said to herself, welded the door shut, and quietly went into the house. She knew what kind of riders didn't leave wolves alone, even in the summer. Though at that time, when all living things are having offspring, any hunting is forbidden. The wolf's den must have been tracked, and she somehow sensed it and came for help to the only living creature that she knew would not refuse it. Early in the morning, Helen was going to the collective farm for her daughter, and had no sooner got off the porch than a frowning man, not unfamiliar to her, appeared in the vicinity. His appearance did not bode well. He was focused on something beneath his feet and staring straight down at the ground as if he were following a trail. Reaching Helen's house, he gave her a heartfelt look. The expression on his face was so strange, as if he were condemning her for murder, or even worse than the wolves were harboring. In a hoarse voice, he shouted. Helen choked on the milk that came from such a statement. She was very frightened, but she was determined to hold her ground and go all the way. Volkovs. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? I see that you are lying threateningly, said the accuser. Your slee-looking squirrels have already given everything away. Don't lie to me, yelled the stranger. I ain't hiding nobody. What makes you think that? Wolf tracks. I didn't mistake them for anything else. And they lead straight to your house. I don't know what kind. There's tracks. All sorts of animals roam around here. And to accuse me of something like this. Should you be ashamed of yourself? When they report you to the local authorities, you'll know I'm a liar. Wendy showed up outside. She was really pissed off. Why did you attack her? Frank Mikhailovich. Outraged neighbor. This is a boor. Wolves harboring, accused Helen man. Look at you. You're a rude man," desperately defended Helen. "You." The man hissed and showed her his fist, but Wendy stopped him with a sharp shout. "I'll see you here again," he hissed. "I'll report it myself. Will you tell me if it's you? Do you sell roe deer hide and meat under the table too?" The man shrank and left, glaring angrily with his eyes. Helen was scared out of her wits. She was scared to death that she would be found out. What would happen then? She would simply be kicked out of the village in disgrace, having returned from the collective barn, where everything had fallen out of her hands that morning. She came to the barn to check on her she-wolf. She was lying, stretched out 6 in its entire length, and to her belly suckled 9 tiny wolves. "What a concern," Helen muttered. The she-wolf heard her and raised her muzzle surlily. "You have to go away." "Honey," said the woman, "there's no chance of being hunted down. Then we'll both be dead." So said a rough bass from behind. Helen turned around sharply, and the she-wolf jumped up, crouched down, covering the pups with herself, left her teeth, and growled threateningly, "You're not lying." "Yes," shaking with indignation voice, said Frank. "Now you've got yourself a city bitch. Quickly you were kicked out of our village. How did you get here?" Gasping with fear, Helen mumbled, "Get out now. I'm not going to leave. I'll call the neighbors too." "Hey people, come here," shouted the man in a bad voice. "They're harboring wolves here. Get out of my house." Shouted in response, Helen grabbed an old pitchfork in her hands and, threatening with them, began to push Frank to the exit of his vegetable garden. Everything went on like a delirium. Neighbors came running. Some shouted, some demanded something. Finally, the whole crowd rushed to the barn. I'll show you everything. I'll show you everything," yelling Frank and making their fake door. That's what the neighbor across the street shrugged her shoulders and looked inside. "Everything needs a straw. You should drink less, Frank." The others looked in. They saw nothing. They taunted and threatened the man for false denunciation. Helen stood there white as a sheet. She could hardly breathe, and she was afraid to look into her own barn. Had the she-wolf managed to hide somehow? When everyone had left, she went into the barn and looked around the corners. It was as if the she-wolf had vanished. Where could she have gone? And with the wolf cubs? Helen wondered. It turned out late in the evening when, walking through the yard to the privy, she heard somewhere back a distinct vibration began to look here and there. She didn't understand where the sound was coming from. Finally, looping in the thickets of burdocks in the farthest corner of the vegetable garden, where no hands could not reach to clear the perennial weeds, found a burrow almost vertically going into the ground holes. It turned out to be on the turn of an old, half-filled with earth on mushrooms. But that's what she said to her invisible mother she-wolf, sitting down next to her on the grass. "You need to get out of here at all you hear. They'll find you and hunt you down and kill your wolves and me too. Go away. Please be buried somewhere in the far woods. Early before sunrise." Before the sun was even up, the mother wolf dragged away the first 2 cubs, then came back for the rest. So 5 times a day. I saw her already when she had the last wolf. For a moment, the she-wolf stopped, looked at the woman with a long, sad look, weakly returned the long tail of the saber, and in 2 jumps left her vegetable garden, slipped back through the hole. It was as if Helen's heart was relieved. Now, no one would be able to reproach her for harboring wolves. But in a few days, she was simply gnawed to death by her own conscience. Helen felt good about being in Maria's shoes. Only now the negative hero in the story was herself. After all, Wendy the neighbor so trusted her, pampered her, and fed and fed and fed her. When she needed help, defended her from the whole village, when she was accused of harboring wolves. And she was indeed harboring them, the very wolves that caused William's death. How to live now? How to look Wendy in the eye? There was nothing to do. Helen decided to tell her neighbor everything. It was better that she did so than that she would find out some other way. Helen knew very well that all secrets come out, sooner or later. Deciding to have a frank conversation, she was very nervous, standing at Wendy's gate, hesitating to go in. And when she did, she couldn't find the words. There was a lump in her throat. She was so frightened to talk about it. She realized that her story would lead to the inevitable end of their friendship. Now Helen perfectly understood why her friend Maria could not tell about her betrayal until the last. Shame and conscience. That was the main reason for such behavior. But then conscience will eat you up from the inside. You will always feel your own guilt, and there is no way to fix this situation. But Helen was stronger and braver than her old friend. After all, she, unlike Maria, found the strength to confess her terrible deed. Yes, it will destroy their relationship, but for the rest of her life she will not be tormented by conscience. She'll know she did the right thing. Wendy must know the truth. Helen took a deep breath, lowered her head, and knocked quietly on the door. "Is that you?" Wendy exclaimed excitedly. "It's our special day. Come in quickly. I just wanted to call you myself." It turned out that the granddaughter's nickname was her birthday today. Wendy baked her a birthday cake, a raspberry pie. It was delicious. All evening the children, their own and the neighbors, as they had fun and put on their favorite puppet shows. And Helen sat beside the contented Wendy and felt like a fish on dry land. Toward the end of the party, when the children were tucked up in their beds, she and Wendy cleaned up the dishes. Helen finally decided to tell all. Wendy stretched her out heavily. "I have something to tell you." "Speak up, dear." Wendy replied cheerfully, concentrating on cleaning. Helen's neighbor felt so uncomfortable. She realized that she was about to ruin all the good mood. The whole party. "I have something to confess to you." She tugged Wendy's sleeve gently. "I'm listening to you more seriously now," the neighbor said, wiping her hands. "You'd better sit down. Let's go." This request embarrassed Wendy a little, but she was still at fault. "I've been wanting to tell you this for a long time, but I haven't had the courage. Anyway, what Frank said is true." "What do you mean?" Wendy marveled. "I've really been hiding wolves in my barn all this time since last winter. And when you were all looking for them, a few days ago a wolf was preserved in my old cellar." Helen saw her neighbor's eyes round with horror, but she still didn't want to believe what she'd heard about pardon. Stammering, the woman interjected. "She was. She looked so pitiful, and she used to bring me game. Those hares, remember? She used to bring that in return. I used to shelter her cubs in my barn." There was a painful moment of complete silence. Finally, the silence was broken by Wendy's trembling voice. "I mean, all this time, you've been lying to me. I'm Wendy, I'm sorry. I am truly remorseful for what I did. My husband," the neighbor said thoughtfully, staring into the void. "My husband died because of you." Her eyes filled with tears, and then anger flared in them to the point where Helen realized that now she had to run. Run with all her might from this place, from this village. "He might still be alive if you hadn't helped those things with the threat," Wendy said. "But they're living things too. It's not their fault they're as starving as we are. Get out of here." Quietly and fearfully, Wendy whispered. Wendy got out, screamed, "What the hell was that? Wendy scum, how dare you suck up to us? I should have realized who you were back on that very first day when you pulled out of the well. That damn wolf brat. Damn witch. Ugh." Tears came out of Helen's eyes. She couldn't listen to it again. Her only friend was abandoning her. But now it was her own fault. She'd made this whole mess on her own. And maybe if it wasn't for her stupid pity for the wolf mother and the wolves, Wendy's husband would still be alive. Helen berated herself for this terrible act, and simultaneously realized that if she had to, she would do the exact same thing again. Now there was only one thing left for her to do: wait for the vigilant justice of the locals. Helen did not doubt that soon the whole village would know about her deed. Wendy, of course, would tell everyone. And Frank, this fighter for justice, will report to the district authorities. But fate has ordered venison with life quite differently. That night she spent without sleep, agonizing over her own actions and decisions. In the morning, no one cared about wolves. The war had begun. Their village was not under occupation. However, almost all the men, and many women too, went to the front. In the very first weeks of the enemy invasion, those who remained in tears saw off husbands, fathers, mothers, and daughters, sons and wives on the battlefield. Helen also wanted to sign up with the Sister of Mercy, but she was not taken. They said that someone has to stay to work too. and she doesn't even have a medical degree. What can you do? Asked her military doctor at the recruiting station sewing clothes for our soldiers, cutting shoelaces to make it easier for them to fight the enemy. Standing on the porch, Wendy and her children watched fellow villagers in uniform walk past her house. Focused, determined to fight back against a new and terrible enemy. Helen could hear the children from her wicket gate asking their grandmother, "Where are they going?" Grandma and Wendy answered them with complete seriousness. War has begun. Children, it will affect everyone. These men have gone to defend our homeland from the enemy. And I will be able to defend our homeland, the boy asked in a naive voice. Of course, when you grow up, but for now you are too young and must obey your elders. War, my darlings, takes many lives and brings much pain. But I want you to be brave and not be afraid of anything. Sometimes it may seem to you that there is no way out at all, but light can be found even in the darkest times. We will win, won't we? Alechka asked in a trembling voice. Of course we will. Her grandmother answered her confidently. We will fight for our home, for our native land. There will be a lot of pain, loss, suffering, but we will cope with you. Even Helen, listening to her neighbors' heartfelt words, were motivated by them. Wendy was a wonderful woman who knew how to raise her children and instill in them a sense of true patriotism. The war, despite optimistic predictions, had already been going on for months. By winter, food in the village became scarce. Everything went to the front to the soldiers for a speedy victory. Villagers ate their cows and goats, and even horses. Now they themselves, like skinny wolves, felt what real hunger was. Despite her enmity with Wendy, Helen sometimes took food to her children. The neighbor didn't mind now. A grudge was a grudge, but the children had to be fed. They'd lost a lot of weight, but they were still doing well. By the end of the winter, things got very bad. The meager supplies ran out. To survive, people ate everything they could get their hands on: bark, drought and berries, even grass dug out from under the snow. Many people died of starvation. Early one morning, there was a faint knock at Helen's door. She, staggering, got out of bed, opened and saw in front of her his grandson. He looked very bad. Skinny arms, bruises under his eyes. Auntie, do you have some bread? Helen looked at the boy with great pity. Of course, darling. She herself now had the last 2 dry crusts of black bread left. She gave them both to the boy, telling him to share them with his grandmother and sister. The boy nodded his thanks and went to his room. Helen took the last of the food supplies out of the cupboard. It was wheat groats and 2 morsels and potatoes. She stretched them as best she could, but only enough for a few days. Then the woman began to starve. One methyl February evening, when the slanting surrounding snow fell in endless flakes, covering the whole world with it, it seemed to her that someone was quietly blowing near the house. Helen got out of bed, where she was lying without undressing right in her felt boots, and with difficulty went out into the yard. Wading through the black snow, she walked to the backyards and gazed into the southern darkness. At the fence stood the she-wolf and her mate and wolf cub. Apparently everyone else had died. I have nothing to give you, Helen said with pity. I have nothing at all. But the she-wolf stepped forward and poked her long muzzle into the snow. Then she stepped back again and stepped with her long paws. Helen added something to where the indentation had been left in the snow and gently brushed the white lumps on the back of her neck with her hand. The small lump turned out to be half the carcass of a hare, a priceless gift in these times. Thank you. Thank you. Through her tears, she spoke softly. Helen the she-wolf looked at her with an understanding long look. In her eyes, Helen saw from the ashes an almost human painful hope. Yes, war and famine have not spared anyone. But still, it is still necessary to keep together both humans and beasts. That's what the wolf's gaze said. The old she-wolf. Mother had not forgotten Helen's kindness. She came to share her food with her. Helen grabbed the generous wolf gift and immediately ran to the neighbor's house to feed the children as soon as possible. She entered the house. No one had locked the doors for a long time. It was so quiet, she seemed to hear the snow falling. Wendy called out to Helen, but no one answered her. Then she walked to the far room, which served as a bedroom in this house. On the large marital bed lay the dead Wendy on her back. Helen realized at once that she was dead. By the grave pale skin stuck all over her features, covering her mouth with her hand, she rushed into the bedroom of the kids those willed to the Lord. Were alive, but very weak. It had cost her great effort to wake them up, gather them up, and carry them away. Having brought down the hair, Helen fed the little sufferers and went to the neighbors to help bury Wendy. The nasty, hard-as-stone earth served very poorly. The graves had to be dug themselves. None of the strong men in the village were left at the proper depth. There was nothing to think about, digging so slightly dug. Helen stood near the fresh grave of her friend, and the prickly snow pelted her face, scratching her with its icy needles. "I give you my word that I will lift them up," she said. "I'll lift them up by force. You hear me? Trust me, Wendy. I won't let you down." A week later, the she-wolf brought them a piece of horse leg, some kind of gopher, a bird, and even a couple of rats. Helen didn't mind anything. She had to feed the children. So they survived that terrible hungry winter, and then another one, and sometimes food was brought to the collective farm. And during the summer, they filled the cellar as much as possible with supplies from the vegetable garden and from the forest. Mushrooms and berries, herbs and baskets. And of course, wolf gifts. Everything was used. "I'll be sure to repay you with kindness," the mother wolf whispered to Helen, bowing low to her gray friend. Every time she made a fleeting shadow in her yard. "Come to my cellar when you're pregnant. I'll kill anyone who tries to hurt us." And Helen wasn't kidding. She had really gotten the hang of her grandfather's rifle and had learned to shoot game herself. She was sure her hand would not waver if it was necessary to defend her family from enemies. The hard war was coming to an end. In the spring of 45 soldiers began to return from the front. In some homes came long-awaited joy, in others terrible grief. At the very end of April, Helen received a mysterious letter in a triangular front envelope. She was terribly surprised. She'd never had anyone in the war. Some mistake behind the brains of a triangle lived. The body of time, it seems, had been looking for its addressee for a long time. The inscription on the envelope said, "Further Helen." The village address was on the postmark. Third year, Helen in alarm printed the triangle and read the following. "Dear Helen writes to you from an old friend of yours. Maria was chewing on something. I'm writing to you from the front. I was one of the first to be drafted as a military paramedic. No one thought it would be so hard here. Benjamin was taken a week early, and I never thought Helen would think this could happen to us all. This letter may not get to you right away, but I hope you get it someday. It's been a year since we broke up, and I still feel guilty about what I did. I still regret not telling you right away. I listened to Benjamin. I hope you're doing well. Helen and you have settled in. It's a difficult time for all of us. Every day, dozens of soldiers are brought into the medical tent from the field. We don't have time to help them all. Many die in my arms. That's when the letter started crying. Huge blots, they also went hurriedly, and lines in another crooked handwriting, blurred from wet spots. I don't have time to tell you everything. I'll write the main thing. Benjamin was killed yesterday. I feel I won't have long to live. We have shelling day and night. People are dying. I'm the only medic left. A week ago, a grenade killed our doctor. I'm sorry for everything. My dear friend, I'm sorry for him too. May your life be happy. I'm putting this letter in my bag. I hope it reaches you someday. Goodbye, and remember that even in my last days I was thinking of you. Your friend Maria." Those long-ago lines just crushed Helen. This letter was over 2 years old, and it had only just arrived. Maria was finally able to admit her guilt and apologized for everything in her farewell letter. Of course, Helen had forgiven her a long time ago. Moreover, she had forgiven her even before she read those horrible lines. Another year ago, an elderly mother had written to her and informed her of her daughter's death, and about the bathtub too. But these lines, coming to Helen literally from the other side of the world, put everything in its proper place. Everyone's fate is different, and we can't know how we're going to live our lives. But always in any situation, no matter how hard it is, we must do what our conscience tells us to do.
Subscribe and click the bell.
She's so uncomplicated. Ethan smiled, and his smile was surprisingly gentle and dreamy. Who? John wondered. They were in a nightclub, but the loud music didn't stop them from talking. Separate rooms with excellent noise insulation were provided for solvent clients. The guys were not just solvent clients, but also regular and very generous with tips. Therefore, this small but very cozy office with panoramic windows and a mirror ceiling was, you could say, assigned to them. So who's the uncomplicated one? Ethan snapped out of his dreamy reverie and for some reason whispered, Slaga, she is such a... Listen, I honestly haven't met anyone like her. Her father owns a tire shop, a businessman, a hard worker, and the girl is not spoiled by life at all. I asked her where she likes to vacation. So she told me, you know what she said? You won't believe it. She says that at the cottage father says fishing, and they then from this fish caught, food cooked, fry it, and with boiled potatoes eat and soup still. Liar. John stared at me. You're a fool. She's playing a joke on you, and you believe it. What kind of girl would have fun like that, as if she's already retired? That's ridiculous. No, wait, I see what's going on. Where's their summer house? Did you ask? Maybe in Cyprus, maybe. No. It's just a little tree, 40 miles out of town, inherited from my grandparents. And that's where he and his daddy have their place of power. They go fishing, pick mushrooms, berries. Listen, she can make jam, and she dries mushrooms and pickles them. What a great girl! She says she starts her mornings with exercise and douses herself with cold water to avoid getting sick. No, but have you ever seen such girls? Not in the movies, but for real. Everybody else has a fitness center and a personal trainer and a healthy diet, and she's exercising in cold water. Aha! And fried fish and chips, plus jam. You're looking for exotic, aren't you? John asked me glumly. I don't even want to ask where you found it, but I'll advise you as a friend. Get rid of her before it's too late. You don't know these country girls, and they're clutching, she'll grab you and that's it. You won't realize how married you'll be, and then you won't get divorced. She'll grab everything she can reach, and you'll be left without pants. Oh, come on, don't make me sad. Ethan grinned. You haven't seen her, Clara. She's like a Cinderella, friendly, kind, and good at everything. Her eyes are like this, and all the time she seems to be surprised. I'll order her a coffee and a cake, and she'll have a happy look on her face. At the Moody's, take her hand in the dark, and she is already shining all over. And when I kissed her for the first time, I think she then even the whole night could not sleep. Knave, she's so cute and sweet, you could fall in love with her. Did you fall in love? No. Ethan wrinkled his nose and looked like a hedgehog about to sneeze, but then changed his mind. What kind of love? I've been with so many girls, I don't think I'm capable of falling in love anymore. You remember Thumbelina, don't you? I got bored beforehand. That's 100% me. And the girl? What about the girl? Well, beautiful but funny, but you'll meet another, even prettier, even funnier. If you fall in love with every girl, you won't have enough days in your life. John suddenly winked conspiratorially at his buddy. Listen, doesn't she have a girlfriend? Because you tell me so deliciously, I even thought I might be missing something in life. Jam, for example. You look for it. Ethan said arrogantly and burst out laughing. Come on, don't be so slow. Go to any cheaper club. There are 100 of them per square meter, and all hungry. You'll treat them to a cocktail and take them to your place. John remained silent, and Ethan suddenly felt sickened by his own cynicism. Ethan had been living in a sticky jam for a month now. It had started out so nice, so funny. Clara, in her colored sundresses, with her long hair and perpetually surprised look, her willingness to admire everything he said, to rejoice at any, even the cheapest gift. Ethan sometimes bought the girl the cheapest chocolates on purpose, just to test her reaction, but she was as happy about them as if she'd been given diamonds. She was so sweetly embarrassed and always asked him to turn off the lights. Every day she wished him a good morning. Yes, everything was so light, funny, plush, like a video clip of a couple in love releasing into the sky, balloons, hearts, and then, holding hands, going to an ice cream parlor. And then it happened, and I had to thrash around, twist and turn, come up with original moves, lie, lie, lie. Lying was the most painful of all. Ethan was more and more confused, with no idea how to get out of the horror that had come over him and pinned him to the ground. The horror looked exactly like the two purple stripes, parallel to each other, on a pregnancy test. It was the test that the idiotic Clara had presented to him by calling and scheduling an urgent appointment. "Come right now, please," she asked. "I have such news. In short, come." "What's wrong?" he asked, surprised. "Have the aliens taken over the planet?" "Ethan, this is not a phone call. Come quickly. It's very important. I'm waiting for you." The girl didn't bother to explain. Ethan was very worried then. The demand, the urgency. It was something out of Clara's repertoire if she said it was urgent. Intuition, of course, was not dormant. Ethan suddenly remembered how, a couple weeks ago, he and Clara had decided to go out of town to a wild beach and had had a wonderful time there until late in the evening. They didn't even want to leave, and she fell in love with the place and kept repeating, "I will live here. I like it here so much that I want to stay here forever." Ethan understood her, he wanted to, but he wanted it to be like this. Warm but not hot weather, the water glistening, and for Clara to walk around in her bathing suit, and for them to be as old as they are today, 18 and 19. He would build a shawl then, right here on top of the hill, and in the evenings they would burn fires and drink cheap sweet wine. A picture to remember. He said out loud, "What is it?" "I want to say that I will remember this day and keep it in detail, like a photograph of you and me living here all our lives and not growing old for a minute. It's like a snapshot, only not with a camera, just with your eyes." He kept in his memory this picture of eternal summer and eternal happiness. However, there were no pharmacies nearby, but Ethan somehow hoped that it would be lucky. And if he hoped in vain, oh, not for good. All this urgency. Oh, not good. What if the wild beach left them a mark in the form off? What the hell is this? Maybe Clara just saw a cockroach and now he's afraid to move, or a mouse. He didn't notice how he accelerated his steps towards the girl's house. Whatever happened there, it was better to find out as soon as possible and not to be tormented by doubts. And maybe it would turn out that there was nothing to worry about. Maybe the girl just needs some help. You know, like move a couch. A couch would be nice. He ran up the stairs to find out, finally, what was the cause of Clara's anxiety. Here's already her floor. Ethan didn't even have time to ring the doorbell. But Slaga jumped out into the entryway in a bathrobe, clutching in her fist a strip of paper with 2 dashes on it. Ethan tried hard not to think about where the test had been before it was picked up. "Look, look!" The girl shrieked, smiling so contentedly that Ethan immediately wanted to run away. Of course, Clara, with her usual stupidity, didn't notice anything and kept shoving the object of her idiotic pride under his nose. Well, what to do now? I wonder what kind of reaction she expects. That he, too, would jump with delight, Pick her up in his arms and start twirling her around? Or fall to his knees and start kissing her still flat belly like in the movies? Yeah, a bad movie. Ethan, what's wrong with you? Is that your face? You're not happy. She finally figured it out. I should be happy. But are you happy? It's our baby, yours and mine. Isn't it great? Yours is. Ethan blurted out the first thing that came to his mind. But as for me, that's a moot point. He knew he was saying a nasty, insulting thing. He knew that Clara didn't deserve them, but he was saying them, and now, at this very moment, he wanted them to be true. How do I know? Maybe I wasn't your only one. You didn't swear fidelity to me, did you? Maybe you were seeing someone else at the same time. I wouldn't be surprised at all. How? How? Why? Because. Do you have proof that you didn't go out with someone else, that you only went out with me? No? Well, I don't have any proof either. So why should I believe you? The girl's huge eyes instantly filled with tears. Ethan, look, there's 2 stripes, that means. I know what it means without you telling me. It's okay, it happens. But what does that have to do with me? Who else? Ethan, what's wrong with you? I'm not with anyone else. Here's a test, check it out. Don't give me that test. I've seen it. I'm not interested in what it says, Ethan. He asked, squeamishly pulling away. Well, where? Show me. Clara slammed her eyes shut resentfully. A crystal tear ran down her rounded cheek, her eyes large, open, amber-colored. At first, they seemed childishly enthusiastic and naive. Where had it all gone? It was as if the enchantment had dissipated in an instant, leaving only the surprise of his own blindness. Where was he looking before? Naivety, delight. Now he realized it was not enthusiasm, but elementary stupidity. Too bad it was too late for him. I had no one else. The girl whispered in a trembling voice. You know you haven't. How would I know that? Ethan started up. Do you think I've been following you? I mean, who else could have been involved? I'm just saying. You go to the doctor for an abortion. If there's anything there, you have to pay. Fine, I'll pay. But then we break up because I don't want to do it again. Especially from a girl I've never been sure of. You'll get pregnant again, and then you'll want to pin it on me. No way. To the doctor, there was a voice from behind the door. She's going to register to observe the pregnancy. Who the hell is that? The boy was confused. The door of the apartment opened, and Ethan saw a man in old sweatpants on the doorstep. Apparently, this character was the future grandfather of the 2 stripes and the daddy of the dopey, blissful one. In addition to the pants, the man was dressed in a shedding t-shirt, which favorably emphasized his emerging potbelly. His vast baldness was a strange contrast to his thick, dark mustache. His gaze was ferocious, a real monster. Good evening, young man. The monster said hello politely and without any transition, grabbed Ethan by the shirt on his chest and pulled him closer. It's going to kill him. The boy thought and squeezed his eyes shut just in case. Definitely will. My name is Christopher. The monster growled, breathing in the guy's face. His breath smelled of fish and something else alcoholic. Beer, probably. Ethan, the boy wheezed. The shirt on his chest pulled taut and rattled threateningly. Nice to meet you, continued the monster who called himself Christopher, continuing the conversation. As you may have already guessed, I am Clara's father. Before you say anything in your defense, I feel it is my duty to inform you that I will not tolerate rudeness. This almost refined politeness, combined with the creepy paw rubbing his shirt and the horrifying face in close proximity to Ethan's face had a paralyzing effect. The guy didn't dare open his eyes, and he didn't even think about trying to break free. "If you hurt her, you hurt me, and it's dangerous to hurt me," growled the monster. "And now a second warning. You will marry my daughter, because my grandson must be born in a legal marriage. Maybe you have not yet had time to propose marriage, Clara, as befits a decent man. Well, now is the time to do it now. That's what you were going to do, like a real man, not a trashy little bastard, right? Am I right? Am I right?" With each new phrase, the monster shook the guy vigorously. "You're right. Yes, yes, of course. That's a smart boy." Christopher, unclasping at last his mighty hand, carefully smoothed Ethan's shirt and patting him paternally on the cheek. "Because if you had been a shameless scoundrel, capable of abandoning a pregnant woman, I would have made a cutlet of you and fed you to my dog. And now I dare not disturb you anymore." The monster smiled and disappeared behind the door. Ethan slid along the wall and sat down on the floor. "Is your father crazy?" he asked. "Or does he always act like that? Or only with guests?" The girl glanced at the door and pressed her finger to her lips. "Speak quietly." "Daddy's hearing is phenomenal. He can hear everything through 3 doors. You'd better be quiet. We're getting married then." Ethan mumbled and covered his face with his hands. It's a nightmare. It was impossible to believe what was happening. The next day, Christopher personally drove the couple to the marriage ceremony and made sure that the applications were written in the proper form and accepted as they should be. At the same time, he kept glancing at Ethan as if he expected the groom to run away or act crazy. "Clara said you're not a poor guy. He said it after the applications were filed. Of course, it's good to have something to live on while my wife is at home with the baby. Well, how are you doing? What do you do for a living?" "Where? Nothing," mumbled the guy. "Work is bad now. They pay me a trifle everywhere." Christopher nodded. "That's true. But no one ever got rich on a paycheck like that. You should try to organize something yourself." "All right, it's solvable. But what do you live on?" "My parents give me a little. They've got." "Well, I see. I see. Don't go on." The future father-in-law waved away. "Well, Clara?" He looked at his daughter. "Congratulations. You found yourself a lazy man with an ego and a slacker. And this daughter," Christopher unceremoniously pointed his finger at Ethan. "This one, look closely, is your future husband. What do you think of that?" Well, the girl lowered her eyes. "Things are different now, aren't they?" "Right, Ethan. He's a family man now. I think he'll be able to work and provide for me and the baby." "You think so?" Dad grinned. "Well, think. It's my business, but if you want to know what I think, I'll tell you this. This Major doesn't like to work and doesn't know how to work. If he could do something, he wouldn't be on his parents' back. And if he didn't know how to do something, but he loved it, he'd be trying to learn something. But that was before, Daddy, and now. He doesn't love you either," Christopher went on. "And his father is, I apologize, like a pig, a snow-white swan." "Come on, Dad. Shut up. You asked for my opinion, so stay out of my way. And here's my advice to you, my daughter. Send him away. Right after the baby's born, he's no use to you and won't be. This way you'll have a child in marriage, and you'll get rid of the stone around your neck. Girl, you're beautiful, you're smart. You'll find yourself a nice guy with a head and a heart. And this one," he glanced contemptuously at Ethan, "he'll never be a man again. He's all right on the face, handsome, but there's nothing good about him except his face. The face changes with time." Ethan gritted his teeth. He's in trouble. Now this car mechanic with 3 grades of education is going to sit there and insult him. "Dad, don't," asked Clara, pointing her eyes at the groom. "It's unpleasant for him. And in general, of course, you have a lot of life experience, but maybe you're wrong. But it's unlikely." "Can I?" said Ethan, who up to this moment had been gloomily silent. "Stop insulting me. I'm your daughter's fiancé and the father of your grandson. Who gave you the right to behave like this?" "Hiya, nobody yet. If you want to prove your worth, get a job, think about a place to live. And by the way, start taking care of your fiancé. She's pregnant. She needs rest, proper nutrition, light emotions. The doctor said Clara needs fruit and vitamins. Go and think about it and get her that, for starters." The next day, Ethan was walking through the yard of his fiancé's house and could not answer himself the question, what was he doing here? A heavy bag of fruit and vitamins for Clara was weighing down his arm. Humanitarian aid for pregnant fools and very heavy. Christopher opened the door for him himself and held out his hand for the bag. "Did you bring fruit?" "Good for you, come on." "Clara is not at home now. I sent her to the cottage in the morning. Let her get some fresh air. She'll be back on Thursday. I'll tell her you came by." Ethan was not invited to come in, and he remained standing, staring dumbfoundedly at the cheap sodden door. "Why am I here?" Again he asked himself, but there was no definite answer to that question. Most likely because not to come to leave Clara, no matter how stupid she was, would be to agree with the characterization that this disgusting type, her father, had given him. And also because he was scared. This really Christopher, a man without a tower, such a man will unscrew his head and then surrender to the authorities, but only unscrewed. It is no longer screwed back in place. Screw it all and skip town right now. And then what? Daddy has long ago and quite unambiguously made it clear to his children that either after receiving a certificate of higher education, they stay to work at his company, or they cannot count on the inheritance and at least some financial support. This means that to run away is like agreeing to a miserable existence, to be lost on the streets, and to fend for themselves. Ethan shakes his head, as if he hoped to shake her out of her fears and any other unnecessary thoughts. I had to think of some way out of this, and as soon as possible. But, as it turned out, no reasonable ideas appeared, and it was clear that he could not do without his sister's advice. Clara stood at the window, watching Ethan nervously pacing the sidewalk in front of the house, probably thinking about something, and certainly nervous. "He sent you some fruit," my father shouted from the room. "I left it on the table in the kitchen." "And why did you deceive him that I'm at the cottage?" asked the girl. "I heard." Christopher stood on the threshold of the room, leaned his shoulder against the jamb, and looked intently, very seriously at his daughter. "I wanted to buy you some time," he said, "for you to think calmly whether you want him or not. You see what he's like. He's neither fish nor flesh. A slug. Then why did you ask him to marry you?" "I pressured him, of course. I couldn't listen to him go on and on about you. But tell me something. Do you really want to marry him, that lazy bum? A child without a husband isn't very nice, but if you look at it another way, maybe it's better to have no husband than that dry fruit of yours." "I love him," I confessed. "You love him, of course. It's understandable. While you were dating, hugging, kissing, all was well with you. But it's the same for everyone until there are no responsibilities, no children. He's a handsome guy, looking in love, holding your hand, talking nicely. Love, carrots, all those beautiful things. And how did things get complicated? So where did it go, his love? I heard everything. He didn't tell you, Clara. Even though we didn't plan it, we'll get through it and I'll be with you, no matter what you decide, did he? He didn't, did he? No. He started talking about how the baby might not be his and other nasty stuff that made me want to throw up. And I'm not squeamish. I was. So let me ask you a different question. Will you have something to love him for when the passion passes? And it will pass. Can you believe me? There will remain the character of a man, his deeds, for what you can respect. You can despise, you can love, and you can hate. Will there be something to love him for then? Clara lowered her head and bit her lip. Daddy, she said after a short silence. I don't know now. Ethan was the prince from the TV series. Tall, slender, dark-eyed in his movements, the lightness of a predator and the fluidity of water flowing from one position to another as naturally, easily, beautifully as if a river were flowing. And his speech was like a river, as smooth, unhurried, and sometimes like a noisy stream. Clara thought he must smell of water. Fresh, clean, fresh from the spring, but it was the opposite. When she hugged Ethan, she could always smell the woods, resin and herbs and something else, but it was so intoxicating that it seemed impossible to break the embrace. To stand like this, pressed together, and breathe in the smell of my beloved. Inhale it and do not stop, do not get distracted. You're a river, and it smells like a real forest. She used to say, why a river? I don't know. They say I'm a river, but I'm not. But you didn't. You're like a river. You've come into my life and filled it all with you. So you're a river? No, I'm just yours. How many of these conversations have they had? How many unbreakable embraces? How can you forget that now? And now Ethan was nothing like his recent self. Where did he get all this insolence, meanness, anger? The way he kept saying he didn't know if she'd been faithful to him or if she'd gone out with others, as if she could look at others. She didn't notice anyone but him. Clara still loved him, but realized more and more clearly she loved her memories of Ethan and the real him she didn't know at all. She doesn't want to know. I don't want to be a daddy. I don't want to be a daddy. Ethan kept repeating himself. With each word, he banged his head against the soft back of the chair. Nancy was quietly looking at her fresh manicure and didn't seem to notice what was happening. She was silently worrying about when her brother would finally calm down enough to talk to her. Ethan groaned for a few more minutes, then lifted his head. Why don't you say something? He asked in a perfectly normal voice. Don't you see your brother's life is a disaster? You could have said something, consoled him, given him some advice. Nancy shrugged her shoulders. Ethan, you're a fool. Aphoristically, she said. It's pretty clear, he said. What do we do now? That gastropub has a crazy daddy. He'll kill me, and he won't regret it. You. Is that how you talk about the girl you love? I never loved her. Ethan moaned. She's cute, she's pretty, and I got carried away for a while. But what kind of love? You have to pay for pleasure. Nancy said admonishingly. As for everything else, however, for stupidity, for ignorance, for beauty and talent. But pleasure usually costs more than anything else. Thank you for the informative lecture. The brother bowed. But what should I do, huh? So I don't have to go back to it. The sister began slowly, looking up at the ceiling. I warned you that your games in bad neighborhoods to the suburbs and affairs in bedroom communities will not lead to good. But since you didn't listen to me, and you, she pointed her finger at her brother. You didn't. Now we need to find out what options we have to solve the problem. The first option is to offer the girl money for an abortion and make sure she gets proper care and maintenance. Dad, tell her that horror, spontaneous miscarriage, but you will cope. You can overcome this grief together, supporting each other. You don't know that fool, Clara. Ethan said glumly. There's no way she's going to go along with this. People like her have only one goal in this life, to have a bunch of children like a pig and sit among them contentedly while a man works for her and all this litter. So this option is out. Nancy stated nonchalantly. Let's move on to the second option. It's simpler, but also more complicated. Say it. Leave everything as it is and raise the child together. Wow. One option is better than the other. Do you have any other interesting ideas? A third option. I haven't thought of a third one yet. Maybe I should just drop off the radar, sorely suggested the guy. Why? It's quite possible. Just change your phone number, leave, and that's it. There'd be no place for us to cross paths with her then. He grinned. We'll be on different paths. And her dad's a crazy tire man. He won't be able to find me. Nancy shook her head. No, my dear brother, that won't do. I won't say the platitudes about the fact that if you do, you'll lose your father's financial support in no time. That's half the trouble, if you ask me. Money can be earned. The trouble is, you're incapable of taking care of yourself. And do you know why? And why is that? Asked my brother. Because the created problems need to be solved, and you just want to merge quietly, disappear. Yes, almost all men do that. Ethan was indignant. You'd think. And that's why they almost all lie as they have to. The girl said, they work for miserable wages, live in shanty towns, and in the evenings drink the cheap liquor they're sold under the guise of beer. That's pretty much all of yours. You want to be like that. What's that got to do with it? It's got everything to do with it. Nancy sighed. That it's not those who run away from problems who live well, but those who aren't afraid to face them. Those who solve them. You have a problem, and you want to run away from it. In that case, how long after you get your inheritance will you be on the street? If, of course, you get it at all, and not crawl back under your parents' wing after you've been fired for stupidity from your supermarket cashier position? Inheritance. Ethan grumbled. What's there to talk about now? Dad's health is good. That's fine. It seems to be as far away from the inheritance as the moon. But it'll come sooner or later. And frankly, I wouldn't want you to give up your share and then settle down to support me, said the sister. There was so much cold certainty in her tone that Ethan felt uneasy. Nancy was, unlike her brother, the pride of the family, a strategist's mindset, independence, the ability to make quick decisions and put them into action, and a persistence so persistent that God forbid she should dream of it. A robot, not a woman. Ethan joked, but deep down he admired his sister. That's why he ran to her for advice whenever he had the slightest difficulty. Usually she managed, thinking quickly, assessing the situation correctly, and giving excellent advice. But today, it seemed that even Nancy could not give him any advice, but she spurred his own imagination. You're a good girl, sister, he said and clapped his hands together. I think I've figured out what to do. The beer was disgustingly diluted. Ethan forced himself to swallow what was already in his mouth, but he set the mug aside. The bulky man sitting across from him was also his future father-in-law. He looked at the guy with bewilderment. Do not like it, he asked. You'll have to excuse me, Christopher, replied Ethan. You know, I'm not very good with beer. But I couldn't explain to this fat and aging man that beer was at least something you could try at Oktoberfest before it became too popular. Well, or at least in the Czech Republic. And what you can buy for pennies at the supermarket is not beer. It's rat poison. Suit yourself." He smiled. "But I like to drink beer in the evening at work. You know, you get tired, so here it is." He lifted the bottle. "Relaxes me, relieves stress, and puts me in a positive frame of mind." Ethan nodded politely. "That's what my father says." Christopher immediately seized on the mention. "He's a good man, your father, a hard worker. By the way, it's about time we got to know each other. What do you think? Because look, you and Clara are about to get married. You'll soon become parents, and we haven't even seen the matchmakers yet." "It's not right." "Yes?" Ethan mumbled uncertainly. "But, you know, we have such a family, well, family is family." The man interrupted him. "Whatever they are, they're our own. You just bring them to us, and we'll make friends." Ethan was silent. "You're in trouble, you idiot. You're in trouble." He should have listened to his sister, because she'd always told him to socialize with people in his own circle. And she was right on the money, you bastard. Well, what? The son of an entrepreneur, for a minute a man with 2 higher education, who for fun is studying a 5th foreign language, may have in common with the daughter of the owner some lousy tire shop. He's just a common bastard anyway, and his daughter is the same, even if she is beautiful. Fool. Ethan berated himself for the umpteenth time this evening. If you want a taste of tart exoticism, you can have it. You know he lied, following a momentary burst of inspiration. "I don't want you to meet my parents because I'm embarrassed, because they're, well, how should I put it, unusual people." "Do they drink?" Christopher raised his eyebrows. "So, yeah, sure, it's a scary thing. But you can talk to them. If they want to quit, so I will organize treatment. I have a brother in New York just from addiction. He's a great doctor. He's got a whole clinic. Sure, yeah, I'll have to talk to them about it. Maybe they'll agree. That would be very good. It'll be fine, Ethan, as long as they want to live sober." The boy's got his head down. "I'd like to postpone your acquaintance after all, especially since Clara's pregnant. Why should she go to all this trouble? She doesn't. But will they even come to the wedding?" "I guess they said they'd try, but they didn't make any firm promises. So we'll meet them in a week." Christopher shouted contentedly and took another big sip of his disgusting beer. The wedding was bearing down on Ethan at the speed of sound, but now he was looking forward to it. Each new day brought the lad closer to the coveted day, the release. The plan he had devised was simple and brilliantly thought out. They, that is, both Clara and her crazy father should be disappointed in me. He informed his sister. They should realize that it's better to be a single mother than to be married to a jerk like me. With tireless energy, he invented new ways to convince the bride, especially the future father-in-law, of his repulsive nature. "When do you think you'll get a job?" Christopher snapped at him. "Your bride is not an elephant. 2 years pregnant will not walk. But I'm looking for something." Ethan turned around. "I haven't found anything yet." "All right, you'll come to my tire shop. I'll teach you everything myself. I'll pay you well. If you work well, you'll start earning well." This conversation was repeated with depressing regularity, and in the end, Ethan saw a suitable occasion to demonstrate once again his unsuitability for family life. The only thing left to do was to summon up the courage. "I don't want to work." Bluntly, he declared one day to Clara and Christopher. "Why should I? My parents still give me money, and as soon as the child is born, I will also get an allowance from the state." How much did Clara find out? But no matter how much it is, it's still money. "And when the baby grows up?" asked the girl anxiously, looking at the groom. "The allowance will end, and the older the child, the more money is needed for him. The allowance will run out, but Clara, the parents won't, Ethan assured her. And when it ends and but so then there will be an inheritance, and not a small one. By the way, I've already decided what we'll spend it on. We'll buy a big house and rent it out. It's for passive income. You do nothing and the money drips. It's beautiful. And you and I will go to Thailand. Life is very cheap there. We'll have enough rent money for 2 people. Why 2? What about the baby? Or don't you plan to take him with you? Oh, Clara, Ethan said reproachfully, you can't just think of yourself. Where do you want to take the baby? To Thailand? No, you can't even ask me that. Of course, you shouldn't take the child with you because of the climate change, insects, kindergarten, school, medicine. In short, we'll leave him here. Let Grandma and Grandpa take care of him, and we'll go there to rest. We can come and visit once in a while. But wait, Ethan. Why? Christopher stepped in. I think it's a great plan. We can implement it. At least I'll make a man out of my grandson. Daddy will not teach him anything good. Right, Clara? You're starting again. Offended, Ethan said, and was silent for a long time. That's how you try to offend me, to humiliate me. And for what? Because I want to arrange everything so that Clara and the child would be happy. It's better to separate mother and child. Ethan was silent, but in his heart he felt that he had just won a small but important victory. Let them continue to think that he was a foolish, worthless, twitchy idiot from whom nothing could be expected. The next day he showed up at his fiancée's house drunk and diligently made noise in the entryway, until Christopher peeked out of the apartment and threatened to call the police. Oh, come on, Dad. Ethan swung the bottle in a cartoonish fashion. Some of the wine spilled over his head and ran down his face. Ethan wiped away the alcohol and licked his palms. Christopher looked at him in disgust, which was exactly what the groom's script called for. Oh, he said, smiling stupidly. Can I call you Dad? Dad? Dad is just right. It's you. Go home, Christopher advised him. Go before I turn you in to the police. So how do you go home? Ethan was indignant. I'm here to see my sweetheart. Yes, Clara, yes, my little darling. Come here, come here. He pinched his bride's cheek. I can't do anything without my Clara. I can't do anything without her, Daddy. I can't eat, I can't sleep, and I can't see you, said Christopher. Get out, and don't you dare breathe your booze on my daughter. You'll come back when you're sober. Having waited a few more days after the drinking performance, Ethan again came to the guests and demanded a wedding present from his future father-in-law. So you don't have to worry about what to get us. You know how they give us all kinds of awful junk, and then people agonize. They don't know where to put these gifts. So let's make a wish list, like some people do. Do what? Well, wish list means wish list. The guests will familiarize themselves with it, and then everyone will decide what to give from this list, and there are only the necessary things. I think you'll give us an apartment, he said, but I'm telling you right away, we need a 2-room apartment, a child. And what will your parents give? Christopher grinned. Maybe a summer house? You put it on your wish list. The child will need fresh air and vitamins. By the way, I've already looked at a nice cottage near the city. All communications are already pulled up, sewerage, water, electricity. There is near a pine forest, very clean air, and there is a garden, so we won't have to grow apples ourselves. Daddy? Clara laughed, but Ethan stopped her with a gesture. My parents will support us, he said habitually, adding a note of resentment to his voice. Isn't that enough for you?" Christopher sighed and shook his head. "Unfortunately, yes. If they had raised you to be a man, I'd be much more grateful, honestly." "Clara," he turned to his daughter, "why do you need such a husband? Maybe you'll change your mind while there's still time." "Daddy," the girl was confused. "You wanted to have a child in marriage, didn't you?" "I did." Dad didn't disagree. "But look at him, that father. Then such a father, maybe it's better." "Clara," Ethan raised his head in offense. "Do you see what's going on here? Your father wants to separate us. Are you just going to keep quiet? Let the child grow up without a father? Because you see, Christopher, you don't like me, do you?" Clara smiled and waved her hands. "Honestly, Ethan, it seems to me that you yourself want us to break up. I just don't understand why you won't say it openly. Because your crazy dad would cut me to ribbons." Ethan thought, but he only said one thing out loud. "Don't be silly, the wedding's in a week." His sister was skeptical of Ethan's plan. It was her nature to be skeptical, she said, and she was probably right. But Ethan still believed in his own strength. Just a little more to go, just another week. They're already at their limit, barely hanging on. Just a little more patience, and the wedding day's in a week. My sister reminded me. Exactly. Ethan exclaimed happily. Exactly. That's just about the day of the wedding. And that's when I'm going to have my main gig, after which, oh, Nancy, I'm going to have such a party to celebrate my release. We'll go to the Canaries. We'll get some people together, rent a beach and party from morning till night till the ambulances come for us. Sister only gave me a sharp shoulder. "Let's see if your idea doesn't fail," she snorted. "Don't say gop until you've jumped over it." "I've already jumped over, my dear sister." "I have." Ethan laughed and hugged Nancy tightly. Clara was pensively going through the countless ruffles on her wedding dress, the dress itself hanging on its hinges on the closet door. Christopher looked into his daughter's room and sat down beside her. "It's beautiful," he said, looking at the wedding dress. "The ribbons, the lace. I never understood these wedding dresses. After all, for one day it is, and the wedding is off and in the closet. But beautiful. Yes, beautiful." Clara let go of the caressing fabric from her fingers and turned to her father. "This is not what I dreamed of, Dad. Not at all. And now I'm looking at this dress and thinking, who am I going to wear it for? Ethan?" The man felt that now the girl was ready to tell him something important, special, and kept silent, afraid to scare her mood. "You know, when I met Ethan," she said slowly, "I felt like I'd met some kind of fairy prince, and not just because he was handsome. He took such good care of me, drove me to school, picked me up after class, fed me at restaurants. Then we went out, went to the movies. Every day?" Dad asked. "Every day. And it seemed to me that it was like going to the movies. And nothing about it made you suspicious." I did. It was only a couple of weeks later that I suddenly thought, doesn't he have any business of his own? I mean, we were together all the time. From morning till night. It's like he's got no school, no job, nothing. Nothing but fun. I asked him, and he looked at me so strangely and said, "I can afford to rest." But here he is all resting and resting. Father snorted. "And does not get bored." "Yes, and when I found out I was pregnant, I thought that now everything would change for sure. Ethan will realize that now he can't go out like he used to, thinking only about pleasures. That a family, a child will be here soon, and that's a responsibility. You have to think about the future. But the further I go, the more I realize that he's not going to think about anything. You see the way he acts, it's like he's getting cocky on purpose." Christopher didn't know what to say. "And what can you say?" Clara saw and said it all herself. "You can still replay everything," he said softly. "Just tell that bum there's no wedding." "It's my fault, too. When I found out about it, I was furious. I thought I'd do anything, and the child would be born in marriage, and then the grass would grow back. But you know how they treated it in my time. It was considered a disgrace. That's what I thought out of habit, and then I looked around and everything had changed. What's the point? Now many women give birth to children, but they're in no hurry to get married. What can you do if you're not lucky enough to have a father? We'll raise the kid, work, bring him up. You'll meet a good guy. And this one, what's he worth to you? He's a fool. If only I'd realized who he was before." "Sadly," smiled Clara. "And now I feel like I have to go all the way. And I keep thinking, well, at least he said that there will be no wedding, even if he refused to marry. Why wait for him to say that? My father was surprised. Can you do it yourself or not? But do you want to? I'll tell him, and I'll throw him down the stairs with my great pleasure, eh?" "The wedding is the day after tomorrow, Dad," reminded my daughter. "Everything is ready, money spent, invitations, restaurant. How can I cancel it all? How then to look people in the eyes? Give it up." Christopher laughed. "Who cares? Changed her mind and that's it. If you don't like it, the door's over there." "No, you can't do that." "Can you marry a jerk?" "I made a mistake." "What can I do?" "So I'll have to go all the way," said the daughter. And the father realized that no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't change her mind. She feels sorry for her. She doesn't want to marry that Ethan of hers. She's embarrassed in front of others, but in front of herself, in front of her child. Ethan was getting ready for the wedding. He'd been shopping all day, but he hadn't found anything suitable. What kind of discrimination is this? Why aren't there stores for people who like tattered clothes? What do fashion designers care about? Are they creating some kind of fashion collection? One uglier, one uglier. And where, you may ask, are the fashion collections for the homeless, where in the end you can get at least a homeless man's masquerade costume? Shopping had worn him out. Ethan was about to fall into despair, but then a brilliant idea struck him. Why look for special clothes? You could just make your own. A pity, of course, but what not to sacrifice for a great cause? All it takes is a little dirt. That's it. Ethan flew home on wings. Once home, he got down to business with all the imagination he could muster. First, he wet the soles of his sneakers with water and carefully walked in them over his sweater and jeans, which he spread out on the floor. The prints were quite convincing, but they weren't the only thing he could do. He found some pistachio ice cream in the fridge and smeared it on his jeans and sweater. Then Ethan poured some instant coffee into a jar and poured it on his sweater. His jeans got a few ketchup stains and a couple of greasy butter stains. Only the finishing touches remained. Ethan, armed with a pair of scissors, carefully cut the sweater along the seam and ripped off the sleeve. Then he stretched the sweater in all directions to add bagginess and was satisfied with his creation. The elegant summer sweater was now unrecognizable. The jeans were a different story. Despite the ketchup, ice cream, and butter, the stupid pants still didn't look bad enough. Ethan stomped around in his sneakers just in case, cut off the back pocket, leaving it dangling on a couple of verses, and in addition, poured a glass of water on one pant leg and poured instant coffee right on the wet spot, then began laboriously rubbing the rich coffee powder right into the fabric. It would be more expressive that way. It really did fix things. Now the pants looked just right. They looked like they'd been pulled out of a dumpster. Ethan marveled aloud, taking another critical look at his clothes. His wedding outfit was ready. Clara sat in the kitchen, melancholy, stirring the sugar in her cup. The wedding dress hung in its former place. The girl had glanced at it without interest in the morning and passed it by. "You're not dressed yet," surprised Christopher. He saw that his daughter was sitting in her pajamas, her hair gathered in a shaggy bundle, and did not even try to look at the clock. He himself had already managed to wake up, eat breakfast, and take a shower. Now he only had to get dressed and could go to marry his daughter. But only the daughter was not in a hurry. Soon the groom will come, and you are unwashed, sitting in your pajamas. How can you do that? What's the matter with you, Clara? Don't you feel well? "I don't want to get married, Papa," she said, without any expression. "I don't. To Ethan, no, you shouldn't marry a man like that. I only realized last night you can't. It would be a tragedy. It'd be misery, and I've got a baby to think about. Dad, can we still call it off? Isn't it too late? But you found time to change your mind." The father smiled and patted the girl's hair. "Right on the day of the wedding. Well, better late than never. Your fool is coming, and you'll tell him. Or do you want me to tell him?" "No, Dad, don't. I'll tell him myself. I'll decide. I'll tell him myself." Clara finally looked up at her father with a tired look. "I haven't slept all night." He understood. "Look at the circles under your eyes. Oh, youth, youth? Don't worry, my child," he said quietly. "You've made the right decision." Ethan looked at himself in the mirror again with pleasure. Perfect. He had thought of everything, or almost everything. No, the watch had to come off. He smeared a little olive oil on his hair to make it stick together, then sprinkled it with flour. It was perfectly messy and even somewhat dusty, and the stubble on his face, which he hadn't gotten rid of in 2 days, had grown back sloppily. It remained to pay attention to his nails. The question of manicure was solved very simply. Ethan went outside and sat down on the nearest lawn, digging into the ground for a while. His sneakers, which he had also covered with earth, looked a little more civilized than necessary, and the guy got rid of the laces. Now everything was perfect. It was time to go after the bride. Just before Clara's house, Ethan stopped and took a few deep breaths and exhaled. And so the final act of the play, Escape from Family Life, began. An important key moment in his plan. Now it is necessary to play. Well, play brightly and even, probably brilliantly. Otherwise tonight he'll find himself a married man. The door was opened for him by Clara herself. "Ethan? What's the matter with you?" "Clara." He howled and fell to his knees. "Clara, I'm so bad, I'm worse." "Clara, at least beat me. Will it make me feel better?" "Beat me, beat me." Ethan, calm down. "What's this masquerade?" "She's pregnant. She can't fight." "Do you want me to beat you up?" suggested Christopher, who heard Ethan's cries. "Clara, get away. Let me get that slacker." "But Dad," the girl was angry. "You've got time for jokes. The man is so happy." "Without much sympathy," said Christopher. "Maybe he should call an ambulance?" "Clara," howled Ethan. "Clara, my darling girl, my favorite, how are we going to live with you now?" "Daddy's broke. They took everything from us for debts, every last cent. There's no money, no real estate. They took away all the shares. We have nothing left. How are we going to live now? How can I marry you now? My beauty, my Clara, my darling, my darling, my darling. Don't be silent. Tell me something, please." "Oh," the girl sighed. "Thank God, honestly." "What?" Ethan stopped howling in surprise and raised his head. "Clara, we can't get married now, can we?" "That's a good thing," she said sincerely. I'm sorry, Ethan. It's probably my own fault for not saying it sooner. But you realize that. What kind of family are you? You don't want it. Neither do I. What about your dad going broke? Of course he is, but maybe it's not that bad. I'm sure he's not that broke or anything. Don't you want to marry me? Ethan interrupted her. Well, yes, I don't. And it's a good thing we realized it before we got married. You don't want to marry me, he repeated, shocked. Clara sighed. I don't. I'm sorry. Ethan rose to his feet and looked at the girl resentfully. So I've been freaking out that now we can't get married. And you? Fuck you. Have a nice stay. Ethan rushed down the stairs and thought that this was it. He was running towards his long-awaited freedom, but for some reason he wasn't happy about it. Good girl, said Christopher. Well done, but don't take offense at him. It's just a slip of the tongue. Don't feel bad, baby. You did the right thing. And Ethan jumped out into the street. Without slowing down, ran away from this house, away from Clara, away from her father, away from her child. From this whole nightmare story, for which he was ashamed and for some reason also very offended. As if he had just been betrayed by his most trusted friend. Only now, when everything was behind him, he wanted to ask himself, what was so bad about marrying this sweet, loving girl? And would it have been so terrible to become a father? But it was both painful and pointless to think about it now. He had thought for too long that he was being trapped, lured like an animal into a trap, and he had been ready to do anything to break free. And now he wasn't needed, and it turned out that no one was trying to catch him. And the trap was not a trap. It's he himself made up a hell of a lot of things. But what about it now? What's the point? He ran along the asphalt path, and it seemed that this run could go on, if not forever, then for many, many millennia. Ethan never tired and never wanted to stop, ever. Maybe one day he would collapse from fatigue somewhere in Cambodia, but that would be later, when he was exhausted. Only then, and not before. But this time life decided everything for him. A persistent phone call made him stop. What? Ethan bellowed into the receiver. It was Nancy. Her sister, which was absolutely unbelievable, was sobbing at the top of her voice. What are you crying about? I can't understand a word you're saying. Ethan, come at once. Dad was in an accident. He wasn't saved. Can you hear me? Where is he now? Is he in the hospital? Is he in surgery right now? Do you need anything? How about blood? We're the same type. Ethan, Nancy screamed. Dad's dead. He's dead, you know. You're lying, whispered Ethan. You're lying, aren't you, Nancy? I don't believe you. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. He shouted so loudly that an elderly woman with a dog on a leash, passing by, flinched and stepped away. I don't believe you. Ethan shouted, I don't believe it. You're lying. Nancy, I don't believe you. But he did. Nancy wouldn't joke like that. He knew it. I'm on my way to the lineup. Set the sister through her tears. You come too. I can't on my own. Come, I'm waiting for you, Ethan. Will you come? I'll come, he whispered. I'll come right now. The rest of it went on like an endlessly sad movie, and everything Ethan remembered was somehow very vague. No matter how hard Ethan tried, he couldn't remember how he'd gotten a cab and gotten to Nancy. He only remembered calling his sister from the car and trying to find out where he was going and where she was waiting for him. And Nancy was sobbing, mixing up addresses, couldn't remember anything. Then she handed the phone to someone and the address was found. Ethan found her almost unconscious, sedated. He had to identify his father's body. Ethan had heard that morgues could be cold, but for some reason he felt neither cold nor warm or anything. His father lay covered with a sheet, and when Ethan looked at his face, he saw almost no damage. That pleased him for some reason. Why? He couldn't remember that either. Maybe he just didn't want his father's face to be disfigured. The funeral, another moment of reverence, lingered in his memory. Ethan only remembered that his sister, despite her grief, had been able to pull herself together fairly quickly and had looked solemnly calm at the funeral, standing at his father's coffin. Ethan was not calm, and he was not calm either. He couldn't make himself feel anything, nothing at all, as if all his emotions had been numbed or taken away at once. He kept watching his father's coffin being lowered into the ground, and only one question kept him in suspense. Why? Why did his father need money? Why had he worked so hard to earn it? Why? Why did he hardly ever leave work? Why did he work like a slave in the galleys? What was it all for if it was all over in an instant? Only now Ethan realized that he had always thought that money could protect him from something. I guess it could, but all the money in the world couldn't stop a truck from going into the oncoming lane. Well, that's just how it is. Ethan couldn't get that thought out of his head. And then, sitting next to his sister at the reading of the will, it all became so unimportant. The money, the share in the business, the stock. What did it matter now? He thought about whether his father had time to look up at the sky. How often did he go out with friends? How many times had he sat on the ocean and watched the fiery, tropical sun sink in? Had he ever even seen the ocean? Or had he never had time to go on vacation? Somehow, that was all that began to matter. Nothing else. Hey, he looked up. Nancy, did you say something? I couldn't hear. You know, it doesn't matter though. Nancy. Ethan put his hand on his sister's shoulder. I want to give up my share of the inheritance in your favor. What? She was confused. What are you saying? Dad made a will for both of us, and you're saying you want to give up everything. Why? Of the two of us. He smiled. You're the one who's always smarter, more responsible. You're determined, strong. You won't let the cause to which our father devoted his whole life go to the wind. And that's why I want you to have it all. It's only fair and just. You should give it to someone who can hold it together and grow it. Not a schmuck like me. I'd really spend it all in a year and end up with nothing. That'd be okay, but I feel sorry for my dad. He put his whole life into this. There's just one thing I'd like to ask you. It's about Clara. I'm not gonna say anything in front of strangers right now. I'll text you, okay? Nancy covered her eyes for a second, then wiped away a tear with her handkerchief. What about you? She asked quietly. What are you going to do? Ethan? He shrugged. Me, I'll watch the sky, the sunsets. I'm leaving, sis. There's nothing more for me to do in this town. He squeezed the girl's shoulder lightly and walked out into the street. The whole world was waiting for him now. For a brief moment, Ethan wanted to go over to Clara's house to say goodbye to her, but he shouldn't have. He managed to realize something about himself. His father lived for work, and he, Ethan, could stay here and live for the child, but he shouldn't do that. There was nothing he could do. Everything in their family, the truest of naturals, fans. Dad and Nancy are work fans, and Ethan, he's a fan of freedom. And that's probably better than being a fan of parenting. It's bound to break the kid. No, better to watch the sunset. He went to the ticket counter and asked for a one-way ticket. Where to? They asked him. Anywhere. Wait for me, though. Anywhere to the ocean, and preferably south. Ethan stepped off the airplane straight into paradise. At least this place looked a lot like it. Tall palm trees waved in the wind, their huge leaves wreathed in opahalas. A wonderful fragrance of flowers wafted in the air. In the distance, but still close, the ocean offered its waters to the sun. The speech of the passers-by was more like the chirping of birds in the morning spring. "No luggage, sir?" Someone addressed him in passable English. "I don't need it." Ethan smiled. The joy, the fullness of life, made him want to sing. Never before in his life had he felt so free. He had a little money, enough to eat twice at any of the local cafes. And beyond that, he was too lazy to think about it. Tomorrow seemed so far away. There would be a day, there would be food. He went forward, not choosing the road. All paths here would sooner or later lead to the ocean. Nancy had no difficulty in finding Clara's address. She had arrived there in the morning to be sure to find her brother's ex-fiancé at home. She looked at her guest with a noticeably rounded belly, a little plump and surprised. "So it is you, Ethan's sister?" she asked at last. "How odd that you don't look like him at all." "Unfortunately, you're right, Clara." Nancy smiled. "Not in appearance, not in character, not in content. But that's not why I came here. I know my brother well, Clara, and I know that Ethan is, well, to put it mildly, not the most responsible person in the world. That's just the way he is, despite his many virtues. But I'm not a stranger to his child, and I'm his own aunt. And if you don't mind—" "Oh, so you want to see the baby?" She was delighted. "Well, of course, whenever you want. What are we talking about?" "I would like not only to see, but also to take care of my nephew." Nancy corrected the girl. "To take over, so to speak, fatherly duties." "Oh, come on, really. No, please, listen to me, because it concerns the baby and his future. First of all, you, Clara, will receive a certain amount of money every month for the baby. Don't argue. Ethan, and you may not know this, has renounced his part of the inheritance in my favor. So I've decided that I'm going to dispose of it this way, with part of the money going to child support and the rest for your baby to inherit afterward. Well, in short, when his time comes to receive the inheritance, and until then I will try to see to it that the share of my nephew did not depreciate, but on the contrary, became more. I hope you won't object and argue with me. No. It is obvious to me, for example, that this is the right and just decision. You won't challenge it, will you?" "No, I know you wouldn't." "Nancy, I just wasn't ready. I understand everything you could tell me, that you're not in need, that your father will help you. But I still think it's justice. Don't deny me the chance to right my brother's wrong. I beg you very much. 8 months in the tropics will get to anyone." Ethan knew that now. Personal experience is nothing to be trifled with. Don't confuse tourism with emigration. Tourists fly in for a week's vacation, decide they're in paradise. Here, the sun is always shining and the ocean breaks its waves on the shore, and over the shore carried snow-white seagulls. For some reason, he realized now that it was time to go home. He had a sudden urge to see his sister, to see how she was doing, and to visit Clara. The baby must have been born by now, though Ethan had stopped counting the months long ago. He just lived, not caring about the numbers on the calendar or the days of the week. Sometimes hired for a paltry wage to load bananas for export. Sometimes for a bowl of food, he agreed to wash dishes in local eateries. Sometimes begging. Once even had an affair with a pretty mulatto. But alas, the passion quickly faded because they could not explain themselves to each other. Miracle Girl chattered in some unknown language and did not understand a word of English. But still their love passion allowed Ethan to live without hunger for several weeks. His beauty was a great cook, and there was always food in the house. That marvelous little girl worked in a cafe as a cook. There was a brief period in this strange life of his, full of coincidence, when Ethan got involved with a local gang, and for a while he robbed them and ran away from the police. Though, to be honest, he hadn't had to run away very often. The police here had an easy time turning a blind eye to a lot of things. If, of course, to offer the officers of the law a small cash reward, in general, it was very understandable. There were far more petty thugs than policemen in this banana paradise, and everyone wanted to live in peace. Strangely enough, Ethan liked it. At first, it even seemed that he would not part with his new friends and would eventually become the new Pablo Escobar. He was prophesied to have a great future. At first, it rounded his head and encouraged him. But then Ethan somehow got bored of it all at once. Who does not know, he may think that the life of any romantic from the big road can be anything dangerous, luxurious, frightening, saturated. But Ethan has personally experienced that even in such a profession, there is enough of its routine. One day he just left, quietly, without saying goodbye or throwing a party. His associates probably thought he'd been hit by a bullet in one of the endless street shootouts. It was a common occurrence. No one was looking for Ethan. And now he was standing on the shore, thinking that spring was probably in full swing back home, and for the first time in a long, endless time, he wanted to walk the familiar streets and hear his native speech. Yes, it was time to go back. He said to himself, "It's definitely time now." If he got a job loading bananas again, he could save up for a ticket in a month. Clara was cradling her tiny son and softly singing a lullaby to him. Christopher looked into his daughter's room and looked at two of the dearest and most beloved people in the world, Clara and baby No. Nothing is more precious than this. He thought, for the umpteenth time there isn't, and there won't be. Life, ongoing, endless from father to daughter, from daughter to grandchild. Clara caught her father's gaze and smiled. He had already fallen asleep. She said in a whisper. Christopher gently took the child in his arms and moved him to the crib. "Do not regret it?" he asked. "For what?" The daughter did not understand. He did not know what to answer. Probably about everything at once. About having a baby. About Ethan not working out. "Nonsense, Dad. Why should I regret it? I had such a wonderful son. And Ethan, what the hell with him? Besides, Father has noticed that you seem to have a new boyfriend." Well. You think I didn't notice the way that Doctor looked at you? I even came to see you off in person when you were discharged. You can't be fooled." Clara laughed. "He's kind of looking after me, and I like him a lot too. Although, of course, it's too early to talk about something serious." "What's the hurry?" "There's no hurry." Christopher agreed. No rumbled softly in the crib. Clara came over, but her father gestured for her to stop. "It's all right, I'll do it." He rocked the crib quietly and sang a lullaby to his grandson. Clara looked at her father and her heart warmed. The eternal circle of life from parents to children, from children to grandchildren. And nothing is more important than that nothing. Ethan. Nancy shouted when she saw her brother on the doorstep. He was terribly overgrown, dirty, and dressed in some strange rags. A veritable shambles. But it was her brother. She couldn't help but recognize him. "How I've missed you, little sister, how you've become." Nancy had clearly crossed the threshold between angular girl and young beautiful woman in a matter of months. She had put on a little weight, but it suited her remarkably well. Her cheeks, shoulders, and breasts had plumped up. Her movements had become fluid, and she had dyed her hair a couple of shades darker, just enough to accentuate her fair skin and emphasize her eyes. "How beautiful you've become," Ethan said sincerely. "And you?" "I've been going places no decent person should go. I'll tell you about it someday, or even write a book." Later, his sister interrupted him. "Tell me the most important thing. Did you come back for good? I mean back to a normal human life. You see, I need someone I can trust." "No, Nancy, I'm sorry." He even put his hands out in front of him, like he wanted to protect himself from his sister's words. "I can't. I wanted to see you. Just to be home. It's been a while, but you can't ask for more than that. I wish I could help you, but it's not my thing. Constancy, business, home, I'll only make things worse. I'll run away at the worst possible moment." "Then what?" "But maybe you could at least think about it." Nancy suggested it. "It's not like I'm suggesting you chain yourself to the office. We could find you something remotely, even something as simple as that, for starters. And then before you know it, you'll be up to your neck in business." He stopped his sister gently. "It's not for everyone. Sis, people like you like it, but it doesn't suit me at all. No offense to me, but suit yourself." Nancy lowered her head with a sigh. "I'm sorry, of course, but I suppose it's true. Everyone should do his own thing, what his soul is drawn to. You've grown up, sister." Ethan grinned. "So have you." She answered him in the same tone. "You haven't changed either. Have you been to see Clara? She's married, but I'm still doing what you asked me to do. She gets good alimony, and when your son gets older." "Thank you, Nancy." Ethan meant what he said. He didn't come in. "You don't need to bring anything up. She's doing well, and I'm glad of it. She's a wonderful person, very kind and sincere. Everyone would be happy to have such a wife. But not you." My sister smiled sadly. "I am not suitable for Constancy. When it catches up with me, I get mad and start doing such a wild thing that I am ashamed of myself. Why should I ruin a good woman's life? Let alone my own child. Does she have a good husband?" "Yes, a very good husband. He's so protective of her and the baby. They're very happy, both Clara and Noah. I think in a couple of years they'll give Noah a brother or sister." "Well, that's good." Ethan smiled. "And now I'm going to go. It was good to see you by. Will you at least spend the night?" My brother smiled nonchalantly. "I'm not used to sleeping indoors unless the weather's really bad, and then I get nervous. But today it's warm." It felt good to be out on the city streets at night. Not that Ethan was looking for trouble, but somehow he was lucky. Or maybe it was just that it was peaceful at home compared to the tropical paradise. He'd never once run into a mugger, never had to deal with hooligans looking for someone to beat up. You could say the city at night was favorable to him. The streets were bright with streetlights, storefronts, and car headlights. He liked to sit on a bench and look at the road, cars passing by, everything like in life. Everyone goes his own way, and someone will get to the goal safely, and someone because of daredevillery will get into an accident, but will get off only a fright. And some, I didn't want to think about them. Ethan had become a surprisingly friendly man. I guess his life as a homeless man, his new life, had something to do with it. While he was rich, few people treated him kindly, only his colleagues in the racket, and those were gone as soon as he was a pauper. But now he was helped not to die by strangers, whom he knew had only enough, but kind grandmother's traders sometimes treated him with apples from their stalls. The cook at the street kiosk once took a long look at Ethan squatting on the curb with his alms bowl, then beckoned him over and gave him a huge, freshly cooked shawarma. And that man in the entryway who wouldn't let the scandalized neighbors kick out in the rain, a vagrant. These are such rays of kindness in a cruel world. You look at it and you become kinder yourself. And even his seemingly bitchy sister. How happy she was to see his brother. How she persuaded him to stay and return to civilized life, to settle down. But she didn't succeed. Ethan had become too attached to freedom. And freedom he now understood as the complete absence of attachments to addresses, cities, people. Ethan would be howling with longing in a week if he were to go back to his old self. And no money was worth it, no money ever. Today he found a good spot right across the street from the restaurant. People come out of there nice because they're full, and if they're drunk, the catch could be great. True, they were often chased away from fish places, but if you don't worry and try to be inconspicuous, you might get lucky. Without any nostalgia, he looked at the huge, brightly lighted windows and polished steps at the entrance. Was it really only a year ago that he himself had been in places like this every day? Waiters in uniform with polite smiles now seemed to him creatures from another world, and not so long ago he considered them idlers, unworthy of any attention, servants. How are things changing? A few more coins fell into his coin bowl. Ethan raised his head. "Thank you, Ethan." The young woman who had just dropped the change into his piggy bank squatted down and looked straight into the tramp's face. Ethan instinctively pulled back, hiding deeper into his hood. His hair had grown long enough to cover his face, along with his beard. He wouldn't recognize him. He wouldn't even recognize himself now. He couldn't see his old self, no matter how hard he tried. But she did, didn't she? "Ethan? Is that you, Ethan?" Clara kept repeating his name, but he didn't want to respond to it. He hadn't been Ethan for a long time, at least not the Ethan she knew. "You're wrong, girl," he said hoarsely. "That's not my name." "I'm sorry." Clara straightened up and took out a few bills from her purse. "Here you go, please. And sorry again. I thought you reminded me of someone I know." "I'm sorry." He nodded without raising his head. "Clara," someone called out to her. Ethan squinted his eyes. A young man was standing beside a brand new car, opening the doors for his beloved. "I'm coming," she smiled. Her heels clicked on the pavement. The smell of perfume wafted away. She had gone far away, and there was no need to catch up with her. Ethan took some paper money from his piggy bank and hid it under his sweatshirt. "Thank you, Clara." Tonight he would have food and maybe even a little beer. What more could a free man dream of?